In this video, we will revisit episodes 1, 2, and 3 of my series Mysteries of the Canadian Fur Trade, which focuses on forgotten tales of unexplained phenomena recorded in the journals, letters, and memoirs of Canadian fur traders and voyageurs. For over a year, I've been chipping away at episode 4, which treats with stories from the early Pacific fur trade, and which may end up exceeding the scope of this series. In the first segment of this video, we will revisit the tale of Rene Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, a 17th century French explorer whose lost ship is considered to be the holy grail of Great Lakes shipwreck hunters. Next, we'll return to the memoirs of Alexander Henry the Elder, one of the first independent Celtic Anglo Pedlars, as they were known, who took over the old trading grounds of the French in the wake of the English conquest of Canada. After that, we will revisit Robert Campbell, a northern Hudson's Bay Company explorer, whose forgotten memoirs inspired the legend of the White Queen of the Nahanni Valley. In the second segment, we will exhume the strange letters and reminiscences of George Nelson, an early 19th century fur trader, who served 3 companies over the course of a long and luckless career. While toiling in the wilds of what are now Wisconsin, Manitoba, and northern Saskatchewan, Nelson heard many strange stories from his native clients, and witnessed some inexplicable phenomena with his own eyes. In the third and final segment of this piece, we will return to the memoir of Paul Kane, an Irish-Canadian artist who traveled with the Hudson's Bay Company's Transcontinental Express in the mid-1800s, painting the natives and scenery he encountered along the way. In the course of his wanderings, Kane heard many strange legends from his native and voyageur companions, which he recorded in his reminiscences, which we relate in this piece. Enjoy.
Today, in the 21st century, it's easy to assume that we know it all, that we've discovered all there is to discover and explored all there is to explore. Leave the noisy and crowded cities of Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, and take a jaunt through some of Canada's 350 million hectares of wilderness, however, and this sentiment tends to evaporate. If you're a connoisseur of Canada's great outdoors, chances are that you know someone who's experienced something truly bewildering in the wilds of the Great White North. Perhaps you yourself, during one of your backcountry adventures, have seen, heard, or felt something that defies conventional explanation. Whether you believe them or not, Canada's forests, mountains, rivers, and lakes are the settings of countless tales of the mysterious and the unexplained. Some of the most fascinating of these can be found in the journals and memoirs of the explorers and voyageurs who traversed the Canadian wilderness during the days of the North American fur trade. Tales of ghosts, strange animals, clairvoyance, and Indian magic. These accounts were written by no-nonsense frontiersmen who had little to gain and everything to lose from their documentation of phenomena which flew in the face of the prevailing opinions of their times. The mysteries of the Canadian fur trade. Although mariners like Jacques Cartier and Basque fishermen had purchased animal skins from the natives of the Atlantic coast since the 1540s, the Canadian fur trade really took off in the early 1600s, when French explorer Samuel de Champlain established the colony of Quebec on the shores of the St. Lawrence River. At that time, a new fashion began to take hold of Europe. From the stingy Puritans of England to the ostentatious musketeers of France, men and women across Christendom began wearing stiff hats made from combed beaver felt. To satisfy this new demand, the Eurasian beaver was promptly hunted to near extinction, causing the pelt of the North American beaver to skyrocket in value. Eager to capitalize on this new opportunity, French colonists in the valley of the St. Lawrence River began purchasing beaver pelts from their Huron and Algonquin allies, earning a great profit from furs which the Huron acquired from the westerly Great Lakes. At that time, English and Dutch colonists to the southeast, on the Atlantic coast, entered into the fur trade with their own allies, foremost among them the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, the mortal enemies of the Huron and Algonquin who dominated the forests of what is now upstate New York. In no time, the native allies of the French and English colonists clashed in a bloody succession of conflicts known as the Beaver Wars. The Iroquois eventually gained the upper hand in this struggle and, in the 1640s and 50s, displaced the Huron and other nations from the Great Lakes. After clashing with the French themselves, the Iroquois finally made peace with their white enemies in 1666. In the wake of this shaky truce, independent French fur traders called Coureurs de Bois, or Runners of the Woods, began making long trading trips into the so-called Pays d'Aon, or Upper Country, the wild territory surrounding the Great Lakes, freshly occupied by the Iroquois invaders. The newly appointed governor of New France, a crusty old soldier named Louis de Bouad, Comte de Frontenac, wanted a piece of this burgeoning Pays d'Aon pie, and so he used his clout as government official to establish a series of fur trading forts on the shores of the Great Lakes. The agent whom Frontenac employed to carry out his scheme was a fascinating character named Rene Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle. Trained as a Jesuit priest in France, La Salle had come to Canada in search of adventure. In the late 1660s, he had led an unsuccessful exploratory expedition in search of the Northwest Passage. His failure to find a transcontinental water route to the Orient prompted his rivals to derisively name his seigneury on the island of Montreal La Chine, or the China. Best known today for his exploration of the lower reaches of the Mississippi River and his establishment of the vast colony known as French Louisiana, La Salle would go on to found a disastrous French colony on the shores of Texas, where he would lose his life to a mutineer's musket ball. In the 1670s, however, La Salle, at the request of Count Frontenac, oversaw the construction of several fur trading forts on the shores of the Great Lakes. The first of these was Fort Frontenac, built at the junction of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River in 1673. The second, dubbed Fort Conti, was constructed at the mouth of the Niagara River in 1678. La Salle planned to build a third fort called Fort Miami at the southern end of Lake Michigan. To facilitate this process and establish his company's supremacy in the upper Great Lakes, however, he first decided to build a 45-ton bark, or sailing ship, on the Niagara River above Niagara Falls. The construction of his vessel was an unpleasant task for La Salle's men, who began the project by hauling deck spikes, rigging, and other equipment up the portage trail to the riverbank above Niagara Falls. Throughout the winter, spring, and early summer of 1679, they labored with frozen fingers and empty stomachs, all the while wary of the sullen Iroquois braves who often loitered around the worksite, fingering their tomahawks and war clubs. While his men worked on the ship and the fort, La Salle himself, accompanied by two of his employees, traveled by snowshoe through the forest and across Lake Ontario to Fort Frontenac for the purpose of acquiring provisions. During La Salle's absence, the men on the Niagara River completed both the fort and the 45-ton ship. The latter was christened Le Griffon, or the Griffin, that mythical monster being the primary ornament on Count Frontenac's coat of arms. Its prow bore a wooden carving of the legendary half-lion, half-eagle for which it was named, and its decks bristled with 7 small cannons which were fired at its christening. La Salle finally returned to the Niagara River in early August 1679, this time accompanied by 3 Flemish friars. Eager to make use of the new ship, he and all his men embarked on the Griffin and set out on her maiden voyage across Lake Erie. For 3 days the explorers sailed down the length of the lake. On the 4th day they turned north and sailed up the Detroit River. They crossed Lake St. Clair beyond and proceeded up the St. Clair River into Lake Huron. There, the explorers were beset by a ferocious gale, which threatened to capsize their vessel. Praying to St. Anthony of Padua, the patron saint of mariners, the sailors managed to make their way up Lake Huron to the island of Michilimackinac, home to Indian villages and a Jesuit mission, and a haven for Coureurs de Bois. La Salle and his crew received a cool welcome from the Jesuits, in whose chapel they celebrated Mass. The explorers were also greeted by the local Huron and Ottawa Indians, who were amazed by the size of their ship. During their visit, they received the disheartening news that some employees whom La Salle had previously sent ahead to establish a trading relationship with the Indians of Lake Michigan had squandered the explorers' trading goods and abandoned their mission. In early September, La Salle and the crew of the Griffin sailed west from Michilimackinac into Lake Michigan and further southwest into Green Bay. There, on an island, the explorer found the few members of his advance party who had remained loyal to him, discovering to his pleasure that they had acquired a small fortune in furs from their trade with the natives. La Salle then had these furs loaded into the cargo hold of the Griffin and ordered a handful of his men to transport them to Fort Conti, asking the ship's pilot to return to Lake Michigan as soon as the cargo was unloaded. The Griffin departed on September 18, 1679, just as a storm began to brew. Aside from the vessel's own crew, La Salle and his explorers were the last men to set eyes on the Griffin. The vessel disappeared on her homeward voyage somewhere in the waters of Lakes Michigan, Huron, or Erie. Most assumed that the ship had foundered in a storm and was lost with all hands. This theory is supported by the discoveries of Albert Cullis, who manned the Mississauga Strait Lighthouse on Manitoulin Island in the 19th century. In the 1890s, Cullis reputedly discovered a watch chain, 3 17th century coins, and 5 human skeletons in and around a cave on Manitoulin Island. Another theory regarding the fate of the Griffin contends that the ship was boarded by hostile Indians who murdered her crew before setting her ablaze. Salle and his crew certainly had their fair share of rivals who would stop at nothing to protect their own interests in the fur trade. Salle himself suspected that the ship's occupants had intentionally scuttled the Griffin and made off with the furs she contained. In letters to Count Frontenac, the explorer wrote about an Indian rumor which held that, in 1680, white men matching the description of the crew of the Griffin had been captured by Indians on the Mississippi River, paddling canoes filled with valuable goods. The natives killed every crew member but the captain, whom they took prisoner. Salle believed that these unfortunates constituted the ship's crew, who had intentionally sank his vessel and made off with his furs with the intention of joining a famous coureur de Bois named Daniel Graisonon, Sieur de Loup. Whatever the case, the Griffin's undiscovered wreck is considered today to be the holy grail of Great Lakes shipwreck hunters. Eight years after the Griffin's disappearance, France and England's North American colonies clashed in what is known today as King William's War, the first of 4 great intercolonial conflicts fought between New France and England's 13 colonies. The last and largest of these conflicts was the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763. This fight for Canada culminated in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham and the Montreal Campaign, both of these decisive British victories. The ensuing Treaty of Paris stipulated that France cede most of its North American holdings to Great Britain, ushering in an era of total British rule in Canada. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, an ambitious young Englishman named Alexander Henry purchased an outfit of trade goods, hired a handful of French-Canadian voyageurs, and set out for the Great Lakes, at that time the exclusive domain of French-Canadian fur traders and various Anishinaabe First Nations loyal to the French crown. Henry was the first of the so-called Pedlars, a handful of independent Montreal-based English and Scottish fur traders who would take over the old northwestern trading grounds abandoned by the French. Henry was followed into the Pays d'Ahon by British troops who garrisoned themselves in the old French military and trading forts scattered throughout the region. Unlike the erstwhile French, who had gone to great lengths to maintain their relationships with their native trading partners, the British newcomers treated the local Ojibwa and Ottawa Indians as conquered people, much to their annoyance. In the spring of 1763, an Ottawa chief named Pontiac incited a coalition of disgruntled native warriors to besiege the British-occupied Fort Detroit, hoping to end British occupation of the Great Lakes. Following Pontiac's example, other Algonquin and Iroquoian tribes throughout the region similarly attacked British outposts in what would come to be known as Pontiac's Rebellion. At the outbreak of this conflict, Alexander Henry was trading at Fort Michilimackinac, an old French fur trading fort situated at the northern tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, not far from the island of Michilimackinac. The local Ojibwa, who had secretly decided to participate in Pontiac's rebellion, concocted a brilliant plan to capture the fort by surprise. First, they lured most of the British soldiers outside the fort by inviting them to watch a lacrosse game that they held in an adjacent field on the pretext of celebrating King George III's birthday. While the soldiers were distracted by the Indian athletics, a handful of Ojibwa women inconspicuously made their way towards the fort's open gates, concealing bundles of knives and tomahawks beneath blankets that they wore around their shoulders. When the women were in place, one of the athletes lobbed the lacrosse ball over the fort's walls, prompting the entire Ojibwa team to stampede through the fort's gate. As they entered the fort, the warriors seized the weapons that their women had smuggled inside and proceeded to slaughter or capture every Englishman they found therein. Henry survived the massacre by hiding in the attic of a French-Canadian fur trader's house. He was discovered several days later by Ojibwa warriors and made prisoner. Henry spent the better part of 1763 living among the Ojibwa. Spared from the more harrowing experiences suffered by his fellow prisoners, many of whom were murdered and cannibalized, due to his adoption by an Ojibwa chief named Wawatam, whom he had befriended prior to the massacre. Shortly after the massacre, the Ojibwa transported their prisoners to the island of Michilimackinac, fearful of an English counterattack and believing that the island would be easier to defend than their village. Prior to their journey, they threw a live dog into Lake Michigan as a sacrifice to the spirit whom they believed controlled the weather on the Great Lakes. After spending several days on the island, the Ojibwa captured a handful of inbound English canoes laden with trade goods, among which were several casks of rum. Fearful that his friend might be murdered that night in the inevitable drunken carousal, Wawatam brought Henry to a small dark cave on the island's central heights and instructed him to wait there until his return. Henry made a bed of spruce boughs in the middle of the cave, wrapped himself in a blanket, and went to sleep. He was awakened the following morning by some protrusion beneath him, which had begun to press uncomfortably into his body. The offending object proved to be a bone, which Henry assumed must be that of a deer or some other animal which some bygone predator had dragged into the cave to eat. But when daylight visited my chamber, Henry wrote, I discovered with some feelings of horror that I was lying on nothing less than a heap of human bones and skulls which covered all the floor. Wawatam returned to the cave 2 days later, having finally recovered from the night of revelry. Henry showed him the bones, of which Wawatam professed to have had no prior knowledge. The friends speculated that the cave must have been used as a sort of charnel house by Indians centuries ago, in the dim recesses of the Great Lakes' unrecorded history. In early 1764, Henry escaped from his captors and traveled with a trio of French-Canadian voyageurs to the fur-trading post at Sault Ste. Marie. There, he fell in with another band of Ojibwa who had just received a summons from British military commander Sir William Johnson. Johnson, desirous of bringing an end to Pontiac's rebellion, had invited the representatives of all the Great Lakes tribes to attend a great peace conference on the shores of the Niagara River. In order to determine whether or not they ought to attend this council, the Ojibwa attempted to commune with a deity they called the Great Turtle, and thus Alexander Henry bore witness to a strange phenomenon associated with a mysterious Indian rite called the Ceremony of the Shaking Tent. Henry described the ritual in his 1809 autobiography entitled Travels and Adventures in Canada and the Indian Territories between the years 1760 and 1776. First, the Indians built a cylindrical tent composed of 5 vertical poles, each composed of different type of wood, bound by a wooden hoop at the top and covered with moose skins. At nightfall, while the whole band watched, the medicine man chosen to preside over the ceremony emerged half naked from his wigwam, walked over to the tent, and crawled through the entrance. As soon as he entered, the tent began to shake. Suddenly, a cacophony of voices erupted inside, some of them yelling, some barking like dogs, others howling. In this horrible concert, Henry wrote, were mingled screams and sobs, as of despair, anguish, and the sharpest pain. Articulate speech was also uttered, as if from human lips, but in a tongue unknown to the audience. After some time, these confused and frightful noises were succeeded by a perfect silence, and now a voice not heard before seemed to manifest the arrival of a new character in the tent. This was a low and feeble voice, resembling the cry of a young puppy. The sound was no sooner distinguished than all the Indians clapped their hands for joy, exclaiming that this was the chief spirit, the turtle, the spirit that never lied." Unquote. Throughout the half hour that ensued, a variety of songs issued from the tent, each of them sung by a different voice. Finally, once the last song died out, the medicine man called out from inside the tent that the spirit of the great turtle was ready to answer any questions the Indians might have for him. First, the band's chief asked whether the English planned to attack them, and whether there were many English troops at Fort Niagara, the site of the scheduled rendezvous, situated near the ruins of La Salle's old Fort Conti. Immediately, the tent shook with such violence that Henry expected it to fall apart. When the tent finally rocked to a halt, the shaman announced that the great turtle had departed. The Ojibwa waited with bated breath for the spirit's reply. 15 minutes later, the tent shook again, and the tremulous voice of the great turtle began babbling in a language which none of the onlookers could understand. Once the spirit had delivered its incomprehensible report, the medicine man, who apparently understood every word, informed those assembled that the great turtle had flown across Lake Huron and over the easterly forest to Fort Niagara, where he found few Englishmen. He proceeded down the length of Lake Ontario and further down the St. Lawrence River to Montreal, where he found a huge fleet of ships filled with British soldiers. The chief then asked the Great Turtle whether Sir William Johnson would receive them as friends. Sir William Johnson, the medicine man replied, interpreting the words of the spirit, will fill their canoes with presents, with blankets, kettles, guns, gunpowder, and shot, and large barrels of rum such as the stoutest of the Indians will not be able to lift, and every man will return in safety to his family." Unquote. At this, the assemblage cheered, and many warriors declared their intention to attend the meeting at Fort Niagara. The natives proceeded to ask the spirit questions about distant friends and the fate of sick family members. Henry himself, despite his skepticism, presented the Great Turtle with the customary gift of tobacco before asking whether he would ever see his native country again. The spirit replied that he would. Indeed, Henry would go on to survive Pontiac's rebellion and make 3 voyages to his native England. Following the shaking tent ceremony, Henry and 16 Ojibwa braves set out for Fort Niagara, stopping at several Indian villages along the way. One afternoon, while waiting out a storm on the shore, Henry nearly stepped on a rattlesnake. When he saw the serpent, he retrieved his musket from his canoe and prepared to kill it. He was stopped at the last moment by his companions, who believed that the rattlesnake, specimens of which rarely appeared in that part of the country, was one of their reincarnated ancestors. Instead of killing it, they lit their pipes and blew tobacco in its face. Apparently pleased with the odor, the snake eventually relaxed and slithered away. Interestingly, a similar story appears in the memoirs of Jonathan Carver, a New English contemporary of Henry's, entitled Travels Through North America in the years 1766, 1767, and 1768. In 1766, while traversing a portage trail between the Fox and Wisconsin rivers in the forest west of Lake Michigan, Carver came across a den of rattlesnakes. One of Carver's traveling companions, a French-Canadian fur trader named Pinessance, proceeded to tell the New Englander, quote, a remarkable story concerning one of these reptiles, of which he said he was an eyewitness. According to Pinessance, a Menominee Indian once tamed a rattlesnake and, quote, treated it as a deity, calling it his great father, and carrying it with him in a box wherever he went. The French gentleman was surprised one day to see the Indian place the box which contained his god on the ground, and opening the door give him his liberty, telling him, whilst he did it, to be sure and return by the time he himself should come back. The Indian was so confident of his creature's obedience that he offered to lay the Frenchman a wager of 2 gallons of rum that at the time appointed he would come and crawl into his box. Unquote. Pinessance took the Menominee up on his offer. At the appointed time, quote, the Indian set down his box and called for his great father. Unquote. Although the rattlesnake failed to make its scheduled appearance, the Indian was undeterred, and offered to double his bet with the Frenchman if the snake failed to arrive in 2 days. This was further agreed on, Carver wrote, when, behold, on the 2nd day, about 1 o'clock, the snake arrived, and, of its own accord, crawled into the box, which was placed ready for him. The French gentleman vouched for the truth of his story, and from the accounts I have often received of the docility of these creatures, I see no reason to doubt his veracity. Unquote. Alexander Henry would go on to have many more adventures in the Pays d'Ao and the great northwestern wilderness beyond, all of which he chronicled in his memoirs. In his writings, he described many haunted spots and curious locales. On the Mattawa River, for example, Henry and the French-Canadian voyageurs in his employ came to a place where the shore was rocky and barren, stained with hematite and punctuated by the occasional burial cairn. The blood-red hue of the riverbank and the Indian graves that dotted it gave the place an eerie atmosphere, augmented by the presence of a yawning black cave, which Henry's crew called the Porte de l'Enfer, or Hell's Gate. In the side of a hill, wrote Henry of this sinister landmark, on the north side of the river, there is a curious cave concerning which marvelous tales are related by the voyageurs. Unquote. Although Henry and his crew were fortunate enough to avoid meeting the demon whom fur trader Lore designated the denizen of this Stygian cavern, they were accosted by monsters of another sort. Mosquitoes and a minute species of fly abound on this river, wrote Henry, the latter of which are still more troublesome than the former. To obtain a respite from their vexations, we were obliged at the carrying places to make fires and stand in the smoke. Unquote. Another riverside curiosity which makes its appearance in Henry's memoirs is located on a scenic branch of the Winnipeg River called the Pinawa Channel. In the summer of 1775, Henry and a handful of French-Canadian voyageurs headed down this waterway and encamped at the head of a portage trail called the Carrying Place of the Lost Child. Here, Henry wrote, is a chasm in the rock, nowhere more than 2 yards in breadth, but of great and immeasurable depth. The Indians relate that, many ages past, a child fell into this chasm, from the bottom of which it is still heard at times to cry. Another Canadian locality pregnant with mystery and local superstition is Cape Gargantua, situated on the eastern shores of the Bay of Michilimackinac at the northern end of Lake Superior. The cape was named by French voyageurs after one of the 2 titular protagonists of The Life of Gargantua and Pantagruel, a collection of satirical novels written by 16th century French scholar François Rabelais, detailing the adventures of a giant and his son. The cape is home to a cluster of tiny volcanic islands, one of which, according to Henry's Indian friends, is the burial place of Nanabozho, the Great Hare, their most venerated legendary ancestor. Henry wrote that it was the Indians' practice to leave sacrifices like tobacco and kettles to Nanabozho whenever they passed his resting place, to ensure safe passage along Lake Superior. In October 1767, Henry decided to make a trip from the Bay of Michilimackinac to Sault Ste. Marie with 3 French Canadians and a young Indian woman. The travelers spent the first night of their voyage on the island containing the grave of Nanabozho, and neglected to make the customary offerings to the ancient patriarch of the Ojibwa people. That night, a violent storm swept across Lake Superior, forcing Henry and his companions to spend several days on the island. The travelers managed to paddle a short distance down the coast before being forced to make camp on the shores of the mainland due to the poor weather. The storm raged on for 9 days, stranding the travelers in their campsite. Henry and his companions quickly exhausted their rations and began to go hungry. Eventually, 2 of the French Canadians plotted to kill and eat the Indian girl, and were disappointed when Henry discovered their plan and put an end to it. Fortunately, Henry shortly discovered some edible lichen on a nearby mountaintop, which the company happily boiled and ate. It saved the life of the poor woman, Henry wrote, for the men who had projected to kill her would unquestionably have accomplished their purpose. One of them gave me to understand that he was not absolutely a novice in such an affair, that he had wintered in the northwest, and had been obliged to eat human flesh. Indeed, cannibalism was part and parcel of life in the Northwest and the Pays d'En. As Henry himself could attest, Ojibwa and Ottawa warriors often slaughtered and ate prisoners they captured in battle, in the belief that, by doing so, they might absorb the enemy's courage. The natives made a great distinction, however, between the consumption of an enemy warrior in the aftermath of battle, and the consumption of human flesh as a means of survival in the cold winter months, when game was often hard to come by. Although they looked favorably upon the former, they regarded the latter with fear and revulsion, associating it with an evil spirit called the Wendigo. According to Algonquin legend, the Wendigo roamed throughout the wilderness in the winter in search of human hosts. Men or women possessed by this spirit would develop an insatiable craving for human flesh, which would drive them to butcher and eat their friends and family, even when other food sources were readily available. Cases of suspected Wendigo possession occurred with casual frequency in the Canadian wilderness during the days of the North American fur trade. Most often, these cases ended with the gruesome execution of a suspected Wendigo, often at the request of the afflicted. Every once in a while, however, cases of alleged Wendigo possession resulted in bizarre, cannibalistic killing sprees, which modern psychology cannot explain. Alexander Henry witnessed this strange phenomenon firsthand in the winter of 1766, while camped on the southern shores of Lake Superior with his French-Canadian employees. During their stay, they were joined by a band of Indians who were fleeing from famine. 2 days after the band's arrival, a filthy and unkempt adolescent emitting a terrible odor wandered out of the woods. The native told Henry and his crew that his family had been starving, and that he alone had the strength to leave their camp in search of food. His arrival struck our camp with horror and uneasiness, Henry wrote, and it was not long before the Indians came to me, saying that they suspected he had been eating human flesh, and even that he had killed and devoured the family which he pretended to have left behind." Unquote. Although the teenager denied the charges when questioned, the Indians encamped nearby decided to investigate and followed his trail back to his family's camp. The next day, Henry wrote, they returned, bringing with them a human hand and a skull. The hand had been left roasting before a fire, while the intestines, taken out of the body from which it was cut, hung fresh on a neighboring tree." Unquote. When presented with this evidence, the teenager confessed that he did, indeed, cannibalize his family, which constituted his uncle and aunt and 4 of their children. Following a failed hunting expedition, his uncle had fallen into depression and asked his wife to kill him. Although the wife failed to comply with her husband's demand, the teenager and his eldest cousin decided to carry out the deed instead. The boys murdered their respective father and uncle and ate his body. Shortly thereafter, they did the same to the 2 youngest children. As the dead man's widow was too feeble to travel, the boys left her behind and headed into the forest toward Lake Superior. Along the way, the teenager killed his elder cousin and cannibalized him. The body parts that the Indians found by the fire constituted his last remains. The Indians entertain an opinion, Henry wrote, that the man who has once made human flesh his food will never afterward be satisfied with any other. It is probable that we saw things in some measure through the medium of our prejudices, but I confess that this distressing object appeared to verify the doctrine. He ate with relish nothing that was given him, but, indifferent to the food prepared, fixed his eyes continually on the children which were in the Indian lodge, and frequently exclaimed, "How fat they are!" Unquote. Fearful that he would attempt to cannibalize their children, the Indians executed the teenager by splitting his head with a tomahawk when his attention was distracted. In 1779, some of Alexander Henry's friends and fellow peddlers, Benjamin and Joseph Frobisher, Simon McTavish, and others, founded a fur trading enterprise called the Northwest Company. In a few short years, the Northwest Company would grow to become a major rival of the Hudson's Bay Company, the great English fur trading enterprise which had controlled the Hudson's Bay drainage basin, a vast region known as Rupert's Land, since the late 1600s. Competition drove Nor'westers, as men of the Northwest Company were known, to expand their territory west and north. In the 1780s, a new English Nor'wester named Peter Pond expanded the company's holdings into Athabasca country, in what is now northern Alberta. Later that decade, a Scottish-born Nor'wester named Alexander Mackenzie extended the company's reach into Mackenzie country, the watershed of the mighty Mackenzie River of what is now Canada's Northwest Territories. In 1821, the Northwest Company, under pressure from the British Crown, amalgamated with its main rival, the Hudson's Bay Company. Under the direction of its governor, George Simpson, this powerful fur trade monopoly sent explorers west of the Mackenzie Mountains, hoping to extend its influence into the forests of what is now Yukon Territory. Foremost among these trailblazers was a tough Highland Scot named Robert Campbell. Robert Campbell documented his adventures in the wilderness of northern Canada in 2 journals. Little known outside of small academic circles, these accounts are peppered with fascinating anecdotes which offer us a rare glimpse into the mysteries of the Canadian North. Robert Campbell entered the service of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1830 at the age of 22, and left his family's sheep farm in Glenlyon, Scotland, to establish an experimental farm at the Selkirk Settlement, a Scottish colony situated on the shores of Manitoba's Red River. In his journal, Campbell casually mentioned seeing a seahorse in Hudson Bay during the voyage to York Factory, the Hudson's Bay Company's Canadian headquarters. To the modern mind, the word seahorse conjures up images of small fish belonging to the genus Hippocampus. To 19th century Highlanders like Robert Campbell, however, seahorse was the English translation of the Scottish Gaelic word Echuishke, a denotation for a large supernatural aquatic monster of Celtic mythology, with the head of a horse and the body of an eel. As their ship was trapped in ice at the time, Campbell and some of his fellow travelers approached the strange creature by walking over the sea ice towards it. When they got within firing range, they shot at the monster with their muskets and watched it roll into a hole in the water.
I feel obliged to add a note to this story after reading the memoir of John Ledyard, an American adventurer who was impressed into the British Royal Navy as a Marine in the 1770s, whose writings may shed some light on the nature of Campbell's water horse. In 1776, Lettier served with celebrated explorer Captain James Cook on his last voyage around the world, on which the crew of that able and illustrious navigator, as his contemporaries often described him, became the first white men to lay eyes on the Hawaiian Islands, anchored off Nootka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, fraternized with Russian fur traders in Alaska, and then returned to Hawaii, where Cook was killed in a scuffle with the natives. During their visit to North America's Pacific coast, Cook's crew members anchored off Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island, where they were visited by Moachat Nootka Indians, who approached their ships in canoes. In addition to offering them a roasted human arm, one of the few controversial pieces of evidence indicating that the Nootka may have once practiced cannibalism, the natives sold about 1,500 beaver pelts to the British in exchange for European goods. The British later sold these furs to Russian traders at Kamchatka, only to later learn that they would have fetched exorbitant prices at Macau, the Chinese port administered by the Portuguese at the pleasure of the Qing Emperor. Ledyard's hints at the lucrative business to be made in the Pacific launched a flurry of trading activity in the area in the late 18th century, the strange stories from which I hope to cover in a future piece. In his memoir, A Journal of Captain Cook's Last Voyage, incidentally the first written work to be protected by copyright in the United States, Ledyard described an animal the crew encountered in both the Prince William and Norton Sounds in Alaska. This brief passage indicates that the term seahorse in the late 18th and early 19th centuries may have denoted something more prosaic than the echwishka of Scottish folklore, and similar monsters of European legend, to which that chimeric appellative also applies. On the 18th, Ledyard wrote, the month and year being July 1778, we saw ice ahead, broken, detached, and low. Finding the ice penetrable, we advanced into the openings. These loose fields of ice are covered with numerous herds of seahorses, who repose themselves upon them after they have completed their excursions in the water in pursuit of their food, which is fish and such marine productions as they find at the bottom of the water. They are a large, unwieldy, sluggish animal, weighing some of them 900 and some 1,100 weight. Their legs are very short and terminate in a webbed membrane, with which they swim very swift and are very active in the water, though exceedingly clumsy out of that element. They are amphibious, and between a quadruped and a fish. Their heads are somewhat like those of a dog without ears, except two large white tusks that project downward from the upper jaw about 18 inches or 2 feet. They have a thick skin like that of a horse, and the hair is of a chestnut color. They are exceedingly fat, and will produce more than a barrel of oil. Ledyard went on to describe how the sailors, at Cook's command, hunted these animals in order to extend their meager rations of ship's biscuit and salt pork. Ledyard's description leaves little doubt that the seahorses he and his fellow sailors encountered in the Bering Sea were walruses. In light of this passage, it seems likely that the monster encountered by Robert Campbell in Hudson Bay was also one of these marine mammals, and not the aforedescribed monster of Scottish legend. After spending 2 years in the Selkirk settlement, Campbell, at the request of Governor Simpson, traveled north to the Mackenzie district, where he joined the fur trade. In the spring of 1836, while Campbell was stationed at Fort Simpson, a Hudson's Bay Company trading post situated at the confluence of the Liard and Mackenzie rivers, an old fur trader named John Hutchinson paddled up to the fort and regaled its residents with a harrowing tale. Hutchinson and his crew had spent the previous winter at Fort Halkett, a remote fur trading post located deep in Liard River country, in order to establish another trading post at southwesterly Dease Lake. 2 years prior, a fur trader named John MacLeod had discovered Dease Lake and explored an Indian trail on its western bank. This trail led to the upper reaches of what we know today as the Stickeen River. Governor Simpson correctly surmised that the Stickeen led to the Pacific Ocean, where the Russians dominated the fur trade, and hoped that a trading post at Dease Lake would facilitate a future expedition into its valley. If the Hudson's Bay Company managed to establish a presence on the Stickeen River, perhaps it could divert business away from its Russian competitors. On the journey to Dease Lake, while traversing the Portage Brûlé, a trail which circumvented one of the Liard River's most dangerous rapids, one of Hutchinson's voyageurs espied a fresh pair of moccasin tracks near the trail. Fearing that the tracks might have been left by the advance scout of an Indian war party, Hutchinson dispatched 2 of his Indian scouts on a reconnaissance mission up the trail. After some time had elapsed,
The natives raced back to the main party and breathlessly reported that 100 Nahanni Indians were creeping down the trail towards them. The Nahanni was a mysterious tribe associated with the valley of the South Nahanni River, a remote region steeped in sinister myths and legends, and its warriors were universally feared across Mackenzie country. Despite Hutchinson's efforts to organize an orderly retreat, his employees, overcome by panic, made a desperate break for the river, leaving behind everything but their muskets, paddles, and canoe. Hutchinson had no choice but to follow his fearful crew. The party leapt into the boat and paddled furiously down the Liard for the safety of Fort Simpson. Eager to prove himself, Robert Campbell volunteered to finish the task that Hutchinson had abandoned. In the spring of 1837, he and a handful of voyageurs and Indian scouts trekked up the Liard River to the Portage Brûlé. There, Campbell and his men found the trade goods that the previous party had left behind. The goods were scattered all about, all the way down to the water's edge, Campbell wrote, just as they had been dropped by the men running to the canoes. Of course, everything was spoilt, except such articles as ball and shot, and the provisions eaten by wild animals, unquote. If the supposed Nahanni war party had passed that way, its warriors had failed to avail themselves of the trade goods. By the time they reached Fort Halkett, it was too late in the season to push on to Dease Lake. Accordingly, Campbell and his crew spent the winter at the fort, nestled in what Campbell described as, quote, our quiet retreat in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, unquote. The explorers completed their journey to Dease Lake the following spring. After tasking some of his employees with the construction of a fort on the lake's shore, Campbell and 3 men, 2 Indian boys named Kitsa and Lappy, and an interpreter named Francis Hoole, set off down the westerly Indian Trail in the direction of the Stickeen River. The small party crossed a terrifying log bridge over a raging torrent that John MacLeod had mentioned in his journal. Shortly thereafter, they came to a second log bridge, on the other side of which they found an encampment of Tahltan Indians who were colloquially referred to as the Trading Nahanni. The natives informed Campbell and his men that a great Indian gathering was taking place in the Stickeen Valley. This event, hosted by the powerful Tlingit Indians of the Pacific Coast, was held twice every summer, when the Tlingit came upriver to trade Russian goods for Tahltan furs. The Tahltan chief confessed that the Tlingit had always instructed him and his people to kill any white men that appeared from the east, as they were enemies of the Russians who provided the Tlingit with guns and steel. Fortunately for Campbell and his crew, this sub-chief of the trading Nahanni was not particularly fond of his domineering Tlingit trading partners and decided to let the explorers live. When Campbell expressed his desire to attend the great Indian rendezvous, the chief became alarmed. He told the Scotsman that a powerful Tlingit chief named Shakes presided over the gathering, and would surely kill Campbell and his men if they fell into his hands. Though I and my band would be willing to protect you, the chief warned, we could not do so, as Shakes' men are as the sands of the beach. Undeterred, the Highlander implored the chief to take him to the assembly. When the leader, seeing Campbell's determination, reluctantly agreed to escort him to the camp, the fur trader loaded a brace of flintlock pistols, slipped a dagger into his belt, grabbed his double-barreled percussion-locked rifle, and followed the Indian towards the Stickeen, accompanied by his men. Campbell wrote, from the top of a hill we caught our first glimpse of the immense camp of which we had heard so much, and indeed the description given us was not exaggerated. Such a concourse of Indians I have never before seen assembled. They were gathered from all parts of the western slope of the Rockies, and from along the Pacific coast. These Indians camped here for weeks at a time, living on salmon which could be caught in thousands in the Stickeen by gaffing or spearing, to aid them in which the Indians had a sort of dam built across the river. On the top of the hill I lost sight of my companions, including the Nahanni chief, and went down to the closely packed crowd awaiting us below, escorted by an Indian who called himself Jack, and could speak a little broken English. Every word I said in reply to the numberless questions asked me was taken up and yelled by 100 throats till the surrounding rocks and valley re-echoed with the sound. Presently, a lane was cleared through the crowd for Shakes to come down to meet me. Shakes was a coast Indian, tall and strongly built, and, as I afterwards learned, was all-powerful among the Indians on that side of the mountains. He ruled despotically over an immense band of Indians of different tribes. He shook hands with me and led me to a tent which had been put up for me. After entering and sitting down, he produced a bottle of whiskey and a cup. I merely tasted the liquor, but all the others in the tent had a drink. Meanwhile, the din outside was something fearful. Suddenly, the eaves of the tent was raised from the outside, and then the whole tent was swept away amidst loud shouts. I was subsequently informed that this was done by the Nahanis, who regarded me as their guest and friend, and who had reasons to suspect that sheiks would murder me inside, and consequently pulled the tent down, calling out as they did so, "If the white chief is killed, there will be plenty blood spilled here." Once the Talton warriors were satisfied that their friend was safe, at least for the time being, sheiks asked Campbell to give him a demonstration of his double-barreled percussion-lock rifle, a true novelty to the natives, whose experience with firearms was limited to the smoothbore flintlock muskets they acquired from the Russians. Campbell did as requested, firing off one of his 2 rounds at a distant target to a chorus of whoops and cheers. Suspecting that the Tlingit chief planned to seize him once his weapon was empty, Campbell reloaded his empty barrel before taking another shot. He repeated this procedure for as long as sheiks required him to shoot, never giving the chief the opportunity to catch him unarmed. At one point, sheiks became distracted long enough for Campbell to slip away from him and his Tlingit countrymen. He made his way back up the hill from which he had first ascended and found Kitsa, Lappy, and Hool waiting for him at the top. Alongside Campbell's masculine companions stood a fairer figure, the chieftainess of the trading Nahani. Years after Campbell's encounter, the Scotsman's description of this remarkable woman would become twisted into the legend of the White Queen, a fantastic tale of the Northland which told of a mysterious Caucasian princess who ruled with an iron fist over the fearsome Nahani Indians of the remote Nahani Valley. Wrote Campbell of this Talton noblewoman, "The Nahani tribe over which she and her father, a very old man, held sway, were then about 500 strong, and, like other Indians, led a nomadic lifestyle. She commanded the respect not only of her own people, but of the tribes they had intercourse with. She was a fine-looking woman, rather above the middle height and about 35 years old. In her actions and personal appearance, she was more like the whites in the pure Indian race. She had a pleasing face lit up with fine, intelligent eyes, which, when she was excited, flashed like fire. She was tidy and tasteful in her dress. To the kindness and influence of this chieftainess, we owed much on more than one occasion. In fact, in all probability, we owed our lives to her more than once. At our first meeting, she gave us an evidence of her own power. It appeared that, during my absence in the valley, a gun, fire bag, small kettle, and axe had been taken from my party by the Indians. As they were indispensable for a return to Dease Lake, I was much annoyed. The chieftainess saw there was something wrong, and, on discovering the cause, she gave some directions to 2 young Indians, who started off to the great camp, and who, to my astonishment, soon returned with the missing articles. On parting, I gave her my handkerchief and all the loose knickknacks I had about me, and received in return her silver bracelets. We walked hard and late and got across the bridge in safety, much elated at the result of our trip." Unquote. Robert Campbell and his men met the chiefess a second time later that winter at their fort on Dease Lake, when they were severely low on provisions. Of their second encounter, Campbell wrote, "The first really large band of Indians that visited us came in February. They were followers of the chieftainess, whom I have already mentioned, and who was with them. Her visit turned out to be a most providential one to us, as we were at that time perfectly destitute of food of any kind. One of our men had died just then at a camp she had passed, and she expressed her sincere sympathy with our forlorn condition. Her kindness to us was unbounded. She ordered her servants to cook the best they had for our use, and it was served under her own directions. We partook of a sumptuous repast, the first for many days, consisting of excellent dried salmon and delicious fresh caribou meat. The whole band passed the night with us in the fort, and to illustrate the chieftainess's extraordinary control over them, let me mention an incident that took place. In the course of the evening, when everything had seemingly quieted down for the night, yell after yell suddenly broke the silence, and now furious savages rushed into the room where MacLeod and I were sitting, loading their guns. Some of them seized our weapons from racks on the wall, and would assuredly have shot us, had not the chieftainess, who was lodged in the other end of the house, rushed in and commanded silence. She found out the instigator of the riot, walked up to him, and, stamping her foot on the floor, repeatedly spat in his face, her eyes blazing with anger. Peace and quiet reigned as suddenly as the outbreak had burst forth. I have seen many far-famed warrior chiefs and their bands in every kind of mood, but I never saw one who had such absolute authority, or was as bold and ready to exercise it, as that noble woman. She was truly a born leader, whose mandate none dared dispute. Her controlling presence and intrepid interference no doubt saved our lives." Unquote. Robert Campbell would go on to relate other strange adventures in the wilderness of northern Canada. One of these took place on June 10, 1843, near a brand new fur trading post called Pelly Banks, located in southeastern Yukon at the confluence of what are now Campbell Creek and the Pelly River. A Highland Scot, Robert Campbell was doubtless familiar with the phenomenon of second sight, a condition most commonly associated with the Gaels of the Scottish Highlands, in which the sufferer is said to have the ability to receive information, usually through visions or dreams, pertaining to distant or future events. The accounts of various frontiersmen seem to suggest that the Dene peoples of northern Canada are similarly blessed with a predisposition for second sight. As Robert Campbell put it in his memoirs, "All Indians I've ever met believe that certain highly favored individuals can, by means of conjuring, look into the future and foretell events that are to happen. And, strange to say, I have known several instances in which the predictions of the conjurer have come true, or very nearly so. In the case I'm about to mention, it will be seen how singularly correct the divination was." Unquote. As Campbell relates, one of his Dene employees, a left-handed hunter named Gouche, was asked by his fellow tribesmen to try and see, through the use of conjuring, what lay before them on their upcoming journey down the Pelly River. The Indian did as his fellow tribesmen requested and made 4 predictions. 1. On their journey, the company would meet 2 Indians on the right bank of the river. 2. Afterwards, the company would meet a family of Indians with whom they would smoke and eat. 3. They would kill plenty of small game, but no large game over the course of their journey, although they would see plenty of large game on the mountainous slopes along the river. 4. They would encounter a large band of strange Indians at the confluence of 2 large rivers. Since Gouche saw no blood in his vision, he was confident that this encounter would be a peaceful one. Sure enough, on their second day on the river, Campbell and his crew saw 2 Indians on the right bank of the river, in accordance with Gouche's first prediction. "That's what Gouche said," muttered one of the Indians. Campbell, who had been hitherto unaware of his employee's exercise in clairvoyance, asked the Indian what he meant and learned of Gouche's prophecies. The next day, the explorers surprised an Indian family encamped on the riverbank. These natives had never seen white men before. Frightened by their strange appearance, the wife and children hid in the brush, while the father stayed to greet Campbell and his companions. When the father found that the explorers were friendly, he called for his wife and children to emerge from their hiding places and join him. In accordance with Gouche's second prediction, the fur traders had a peaceful smoke and dinner with the family before continuing on their journey. Campbell and company continued on to the Pelly's confluence with what Campbell named the Lewis River, a tributary of the upper Yukon River. Early next day, Campbell wrote, "A short distance below the forks, we came upon a large band of Wood Indians, whom we took completely by surprise, which almost amounted to awe, as they had never seen white men before. 2 of their leading chiefs were tall, stalwart, good-looking men, clad from head to toe in dressed deerskins, ornamented with beads and porcupine quills of all colors." Unquote. These were northern Tachoni Indians, and Campbell's run-in with them satisfied Gouche's 4th prediction. The explorers ate, smoked, conversed, and exchanged presents with the Tachoni Indians. When the natives warned Campbell's crew that they would encounter hostile cannibals downriver, the voyageurs refused to proceed any further, and Campbell was obliged to turn his party around. When their expedition finally came to an end, the 1st, 2nd, and 4th of Gouche's predictions had been realized. Whether or not the 3rd prophecy was fulfilled depends on one's definition of big game. Although Campbell and his crew had seen plenty of bear and moose on the rocky heights overlooking the river, they were obliged to subsist on bighorn sheep throughout the course of their journey. The crowning achievement of Robert Campbell's long and arduous career in the Canadian Northwest was his 1848 founding of Fort Selkirk at the confluence of the Pelly and Lewis rivers, just upriver of his 1843 run-in with the northern Tachoni Indians. In the years that followed Fort Selkirk's establishment, Campbell tried in vain to compete for Yukon furs with the better supplied Russians on the Pacific coast. In the Saturday, May 1st, 1852 entry in his second journal, Campbell wrote, "I was awoke early this morning by the chattering of a magpie just outside the wall where I slept. An unusual circumstance, seeing that bird is rarely seen in this country, and that I have not seen any for years. As soon as I went out to look at it, it shortly disappeared before any person was up. It put me in mind of dear home, where it is so common, but what it had to communicate I could not comprehend. Granted may be a forerunner of good tidings." Unquote. 3.5 months later, on August 20th, 1852, Robert Campbell watched 27 Chilkat Tlingit from the Pacific coast haul their canoes onto the banks of the Pelly and make their way towards Fort Selkirk. When the Chilkats loaded their muskets, apparently intent on causing mischief, Campbell ordered his men to barricade the fort's doors. The Indians spent the night attempting to break into Fort Selkirk, prying at every window. The following day, on Saturday, August 21st, 1852, the Chilkats finally broke into Fort Selkirk and plundered its storeroom. When Campbell attempted to bar the door to his employees' living quarters, 3 Chilkat braves leveled their rifles at his heart. One warrior moved to stab the traitor with his knife. Campbell was saved at the last moment by one of his dogs, who leaped onto the warrior and took a knife to the heart in defense of its master. In the chaos that ensued, Campbell and his employees managed to escape the fort and flee downriver in canoes. By the time they returned with a band of friendly Tachoni Indians, they found the fort deserted and stripped of its contents. In later life, Robert Campbell firmly maintained that the magpie he had seen on the morning of May 1st, 1852, was an omen sent by God to warn him of the trouble that awaited him. Omen or not, the tale of Robert Campbell and the magpie, like the shaking tent of the Ojibwa and the fate of La Salle's ship, the Griffin, remains one of the many great unsolved mysteries of the Canadian fur trade.
Among the richest source of strange tales set in the Canadian wilderness are the writings of a 19th century fur trader named George Nelson, whose career spans one of the most interesting periods in the history of the Canadian fur trade. George Nelson was born on June 4th, 1786, in the city of Montreal, Quebec. He spent most of his childhood in the town of William Henry, Lower Canada, now Sorel-Tracy, Quebec, where his father, an English immigrant, worked as a schoolmaster. Like most residents of William Henry at that time, Nelson's mother was a British Loyalist refugee who had fled New York for Canada during the American Revolution. His parents provided him with a good classical education, as evidenced by the quality of his writing in the many journals, letters, and memoirs he would later pen. In a later reminiscence, Nelson described becoming seized with a delirium occasioned by the arrival of voyageurs in William Henry. These, he wrote, were easily distinguished by their gay and lofty mien and jaunty air, as men who had faced dangers and conquered difficulties they only were capable of. The free and thoughtless way in which they squandered their money was not the least of the wonders to those who were unacquainted with influence of example, and the habit of thoughtlessness so natural to a roving life. In 1802, several months prior to his 16th birthday, Nelson traveled to Montreal and secured a position as a clerk with the XY Company, a small fur trading syndicate which had fractured from the larger Northwest Company, or NWC, just a few years earlier, whose ranks had recently been bolstered by Sir Alexander Mackenzie, the celebrated Scottish explorer who paddled the length of the Great Northern Mackenzie River in 1789. Interestingly, among the party of XY Company men with whom Nelson set out from Lachine, on the island of Montreal, were 2 green recruits, who would go on to forge considerable reputations for themselves in the wilderness of North America. 22-year-old Samuel Black, who would explore much of what is now northern British Columbia on behalf of the NWC, and William Morrison, who is said to be the first white man to lay eyes on Lake Itasca, the headwater of the Mississippi River. Nelson described his subsequent journey from Lachine to the Grand Portage, at the western end of Lake Superior, in a later reminiscence entitled A Winter in the St. Croix Valley, which was published posthumously in the March 1947 issue of the journal Minnesota History. This account contains several old voyageur legends, which Nelson learned from his French-Canadian companions. Shortly after leaving Lachine, the travelers stopped to pay their respects at the Chapel of St. Anne, located on the westernmost tip of the island of Montreal.
a time-honored voyageur tradition, Saint Anne being the patron saint of voyageurs. That accomplished, Nelson and his companions left the St. Lawrence and traveled up the Ottawa River in birch-bark canoes. At a portage on the Ottawa River called the Grand Calumet, the French-Canadian voyageurs who handled the canoes told Nelson about a strange event said to have taken place there in 1759, just prior to the British conquest of Canada, when the trading grounds of the so-called upper country surrounding the Great Lakes still remained in the hands of the French. One summer day, the story went, a party of voyageurs returning from either Fort Michilimackinac, at the northern tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, or the Grand Portage, were in the process of hauling their canoe and furs over the Grand Calumet Portage when they stumbled into a large Iroquois war party. A cacophony of blood-curdling war cries erupted from the Iroquois ranks, prompting the French Canadians to leap into their canoes and paddle desperately downstream, plunging headlong into the frothing rapids which the Grand Calumet Trail circumvents. Only one poor voyageur was unable to make it into the canoe on account of a bruised heel. Everyone most naturally put up prayers, Nelson wrote, and vowed masses for their deliverance. They were carried over safely. They did not even ship any water. The next portage being only a few hundred yards off, they escaped and drove to Montreal with the utmost expedition. The Iroquois ran too to the lower end and saw them arriving at the portage. As the Iroquois braves prepared to attack the voyageurs, they noticed a tall woman in white robes standing at the bow of their canoe, as if guiding it through the current. The French Canadians saw this apparition as well, and believed it to be the Virgin Mary, the daughter of their patron Saint Anne. Suspecting that the woman in white must be some sort of divine protectress, the Iroquois warriors concluded that an assault on the voyageurs would be as fruitless as impious, and abandoned their pursuit. This was certainly a miraculous escape, Nelson concluded. It was indeed in the summer and the waters low, yet no bark canoe even at very low water can withstand the furious commotions. 10 days later, a party from Montreal returned to the Grand Calumet to rescue the lone voyageur who had been left behind. After much research, Nelson wrote, they found him dead, in a hole he had himself dug out with a paddle. He died from hunger, disease, and fright. Some say the body was not yet quite cold. Some of those who have commented upon Nelson's tale have suggested that it is an anachronistic version of a semi-legendary event said to have actually occurred at the Grand Calumet in 1709. According to this tale, which has a number of different versions, the unfortunate voyageur left behind on the portage trail was a French-Canadian named Jean Cadieu. Legend has it that Cadieu heroically remained ashore with an Algonquin friend in order to distract the Iroquois warriors from his wife and children, who had been traveling with the voyageurs. He and his companion began firing their muskets at the Iroquois from concealment in the trees, commencing a long and grueling firefight. The French-Canadian was mortally wounded in this skirmish, and, with the little strength that remained to him, dug himself a Christian grave, complete with a wooden cross, in which he lay down to die. When his companions later recovered his body, they found him clutching a sheet of birch bark, on which he had written a poem in his own blood. This verse, called Cadieu's Lament, was later put to music, and became one of the more popular shanties to be sung by the voyageurs of the upper country. Nelson and his companions continued up the Ottawa and further up the Mattawa River. On that narrower waterway, the voyageurs told Nelson another strange story about a fur trader named Mystery of Lafremboise, who traded at Fort Michilimackinac. One spring, on his return journey to Montreal, Lafremboise disembarked on the shores of the Mattawa River, and without warning or any apparent cause, fled into the woods. Startled and confused, his voyageurs followed him into the forest, and attempted to persuade him to return to the canoes. He would allow them to come so near as to almost touch him, Nelson wrote, and immediately bound off like a deer into the woods. The voyageurs pursued Lafremboise in this manner for some time, but eventually lost track of him, deep within the Mattawa wilderness. With great reluctance, they conceded that they would have to leave their friend behind if they hoped to transport their furs to Montreal. Knowing that other canoe-going parties were behind them, they returned to the river, drove a long pole into the riverbank, to which they tied a letter describing the strange and tragic development, said a prayer for Lafremboise' safety and salvation, and continued downriver. The following day, the voyageurs made camp at another stopping place. To their astonishment, they found Lafremboise walking leisurely about the grounds. Incredibly, the fur trader appeared to have beaten his canoe-going companions to the location on foot. When he observed the voyageurs' arrival, Lafremboise flew into a panic and slinked into the woods. They followed, but to no purpose, Nelson wrote. In the afternoon they again saw him, in another place and far distant. He exhibited the same alarm. They endeavored again, but to no avail. They immediately concluded, of course, there must be something supernatural in this, for it was utterly impossible that any human being by his own mere exertions or powers could possibly travel such immense distances so rapidly without aid. They concluded it must be the evil spirit who thus transported him. Nelson and his voyageurs continued up the water trail to Lake Nipissing and the Great Lakes beyond. On the French River, which drains Nipissing into Lake Huron's Georgian Bay, they came to a beautiful spot, which the voyageurs called L'Enfant Perdu, or the Lost Child. The Indians called it the Crying Child, Nelson wrote, from the cries of a child heard in the ground. After much search, they decided upon digging in the earth. The excavation is still distinctly visible, several 100 feet long, and as they approach the hill it is very deep. They gave up in despair. After digging many days and hearing the cries of a child in distress, they ceased from fatigue, and I dare say, fear too. They had to leave the place, for the cries still continued, and sometimes so near the surface they fancied to see it. This legend evokes a similar story, sometimes also referred to as L'Enfant Perdu, about a native child who fell into a fissure in the rock at the head of a portage trail on the Pinoa Channel, more than 750 miles northwest of the French River. Years later, Nelson briefly mentioned this other story in his journal. The company continued on past St. Mary's River and across Lake Superior to the Grand Portage, where its members split up and headed for their respective destinations. Nelson's first post was at a place called Yellow Lake, in the forests south of Lake Superior, in the heart of what is now the American state of Wisconsin. Although the region south of the 4 largest Great Lakes, which was known at the time as the Northwest Territory, officially belonged to the United States at that time, Canadian fur traders continued to ply their trade there with the blessing of the British Crown, the latter hoping that such commerce would hinder westward American expansion. Nelson's first year in the fur trade was a trial by fire. Although but a thoroughly green teenager, by dint of his education he was put in charge of seasoned French-Canadian voyageurs many years his senior, and thrust into service without any training or guidance. Both his subordinates and the natives with whom he traded took advantage of his inexperience, the former shirking their duties out of laziness or cowardice, and the latter extorting trade goods from him through the threat of violence. One native hunter and guide called Le Commis, on whom Nelson heavily relied, coerced the young man into marrying his teenage daughter, a commitment which Nelson was reluctant to make for fear of incurring the displeasure and low opinion of his superior, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, who forbade his clerks from entering into such country marriages. Nelson documented his trials and tribulations in both Contemporary Journal and in 1836 Reminiscence, which historians call the Sorel Journal, often remarking that he was fortunate to have made his mistakes in the Wisconsin district rather than in the north, where both the country and its human inhabitants were less forgiving. Nelson's first truly strange experience in the fur country occurred on the evening of November 28, 1803, during his second season in Wisconsin, which saw him in charge of an XY Company post on the Chippewa River. That night, a fearful Ojibwa hunter named Chubby visited his tent and begged that he be let inside. The young fur trader acquiesced and invited the hunter to lie down on a blanket inside. Unbeknownst to Nelson, Chubby had just committed a murder and was hiding from his victim's vengeful relatives. Back when he was a child, Chubby's father had been killed by a fellow Ojibwa, a haughty and well-built hunter whom the other band members feared to cross. In those days, Ojibwa custom dictated that the family members of a murder victim had the right and responsibility to avenge the deceased by killing either the murderer himself or a member of his family. as Chubby had no adult male relatives capable of bringing the killer to justice at the time. However, the murderer got away with his crime. Chubby grew to manhood breaking trails and sharing campfires with his father's killer, secretly biding his time until he had the strength, courage, and opportunity to take his revenge. That evening, in the fall of 1803, Chubby saw his father's murderer chatting and drinking with his own brother. Deciding that the time had come to mete out Indian justice, he approached the older man and stabbed him 3 times in the chest with his hunting knife. Mortally wounded, the middle-aged murderer drew his own knife and slashed at Chubby's brother, with whom he had been chatting, suspecting him to be the culprit. Quickly realizing his error, the dying man then stabbed Chubby deep in the left side, beneath his ribs. The older man proceeded to chase Chubby for a short distance, before collapsing and succumbing to his wounds. Chubby made his way to Nelson's tent and asked the fur trader to shelter him, afraid that the dead man's relatives would soon be on the lookout for him. Knowing nothing of the man's injury, nor the nature of his deed, Nelson agreed. Around midnight, 2 concerned friends arrived at the fur trader's tent and asked to see Chubby's wound. At his friend's insistence, Chubby stirred from his blanket and propped himself up on his elbow, revealing a dark puddle of blood beneath him. As he laid upon his left side, Nelson wrote, a piece of his liver, or something from his inside, that appeared to have a number of small veins, hung out about 3 inches long through his side. Nelson described the organ as being flat and pointed, and wrote that it resembled the spleen of a hog in both size and shape. To Nelson's horror and astonishment, the Indians promptly severed the organ as close as they could to the wounded man's body, allowing the remainder to slip back into the gaping cavity. I shall relate the sequel, Nelson continued, though I am well aware no one will believe me. They gave him the piece and made him eat it. He swallowed it down almost as easily as I would a piece of sugar cake. Amazingly, Chubby survived this disturbing operation and went on to make a full recovery. The winter of 1803-04 was a particularly unpleasant one for the men of the XY Company, who were forced to abandon their trading post and travel among their Ojibwa patrons to avoid the depredations of the neighboring Dakota Sioux, with whom the Ojibwa were at war. Spurred by desperation, the natives with whom Nelson traveled resorted to conjuring to solve their problems, engaging in a mysterious necromantic ritual, during which they purported to communicate with personal supernatural assistants, which Nelson called familiars. Nelson's first experience with this ancient Ojibwa rite took place in December 1803, while he and his men were camped outside the cabin of a retired voyageur named Rene. Short on trading goods, Nelson ordered 2 of his voyageurs to return to their abandoned post and retrieve a barrel of rum from the storehouse. When the men failed to return by December 14th, 7 days beyond the date of their expected arrival, an old Indian offered to see what had befallen them for the price of a 6-foot-long cord of tobacco. Knowing that the elder had a reputation as an excellent conjurer, Nelson agreed. That night, after the rest of the camp had retired to bed, the old Indian entered his own tent and prepared his medicine, working as he insisted he must without any spectators. The following morning, he emerged from his tent and declared that the 2 men would return that day at noon. He described the site at which they had camped the previous night in great detail, and maintained that they had encountered difficulties on the trail, having nearly drowned, and long since exhausted their provisions. But they are well, he concluded, and bring the rum. Sure enough, the 2 voyageurs arrived at the cabin the following day, bearing a keg of rum. Their campsite proved to have appeared exactly as the old Indian described it, and they had indeed nearly drowned and lost all their provisions during their journey, just like the conjurer predicted. As the winter progressed, Nelson and his men, along with their Ojibwa neighbors, began to go hungry. We had a small stock of dry provisions, Nelson explained in an 1825 letter to his father, written decades after the event, and speared a few fish once or twice, but there were so many of us that they were soon brought to short commons, as the strip of country we were then going through contained no other animals but a few straggling bears. But these animals at this season could not be found, notwithstanding all the exertions of our hunters. In early February 1804, at the insistence of the Ojibwa women with whom he traveled, Nelson applied to the band's medicine man, paying him 1.5 pounds of tobacco so that he might ensure a successful hunt through divination. For 3 nights in a row, the medicine man smoked his pipe, shook his rattle, and prayed to the spirits, afterwards assuring the company that they would kill a bear the following day. Despite the shaman's hopeful predictions, however, the hunters returned to camp each evening empty-handed. "There was another Indian in company with us," wrote Nelson, "but tenting by himself and his family. This Indian, who was very fond of me, would frequently call me in and give me a share of what he had to eat. One evening, this native, whom Nelson in another reminiscence identified as the aforementioned Chubby, told Nelson that he would like to try his hand at conjuring, but was afraid that he might have polluted his person, thereby rendering himself unworthy of the skill which such work requires, by killing his father's murderer earlier that autumn. Nevertheless, Chubby was hopeful that his familiars, or spirit guides, might allow him to conjure on the account of the fur traders. That night, Chubby set about preparing his medicine. He had an immense large drum, Nelson wrote, as large as those among the military, but stretched hard. Upon this he beat time, but very hard, to accord with his songs, which were as loud as he could bawl. All night long, the native alternated between beating his drum, shaking his rattle, praying and smoking. At dawn, he emerged from his tent and declared that 2 particular Indians, Nelson's father-in-law, Lecomi, and his son, would each kill a bear that day. He told the son that he would find his bear quickly, giving him precise directions to its location. He prophesied that Comi, on the other hand, would pass very near his own bear, but would not see it. Once he began to feel hopeless, Comi was to retrace his steps, and would find his bear nestled in the hollow of a fallen tree. The conjurer claimed that he too would secure a bear, but would do so only with much difficulty. "I need not tell you how long we laughed at the poor devil," Nelson wrote, "but in the evening we found all that he predicted perfectly verified. This, I assure you, is a fact, and will maintain it, notwithstanding everything skeptics, excuse the term, or those unacquainted, or but superficially so, with these people might say. And I am also certain that he had no previous knowledge of their being there, for there was plenty of snow, and there were no other tracks but those of these 2 human hunters." In a later reminiscence in which he elaborated on this story, Nelson concluded, "This is so strange and so out of the way that I will ask no one to believe it. Those who will not believe the gospel will still less credit this, yet I say it is true, believe who may. We had a splendid feast that night, for they were very fat." Years after his stint in Wisconsin, in 1811, Nelson wrote a letter to his father, in which he outlined some of the beliefs and customs of the Ojibwa with whom he lived and traded. In the first chapter of this ethnology, he described the Ojibwa legend of the Thunderbird. "The general pastime among the Indians, of their evenings in winter," Nelson wrote, "is their telling of stories, which are not less various and curious than superstitious. They will tell you stories of the thunder, which they take to be birds of enormous size, and of the most hideous shape and figure. Some among them have these birds to reside occasionally in the water, where they make a terrible havoc with anything human that opposes them." In late June 1804, Nelson and his men traveled from Wisconsin to the Grand Portage on the western shores of Lake Superior, the site of the XY Company's field headquarters, with their season's take of furs. By the time they arrived, rumor had already reached Nelson's superior, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, or the Knight, as Nelson and the voyageurs often referred to him, of Nelson's having taken a native wife, a practice of which he thoroughly disapproved. In his journal, Nelson described how Mackenzie, who had treated him with paternal kindness prior to his Wisconsin posting, now spoke very little to him, and seldom took any notice of him, which he was very sorry for. Nelson stayed at the Grand Portage for 3 weeks, awaiting further orders. In a later reminiscence, he wrote, "The Knight sent for me, and reprimanded me in a true fatherly manner, because he had had time to examine my ways, and told me to prepare to go into the north, Lake Winnipeg. I thanked him, as was my duty, and I am sure he saw in my eyes there was not so much to blame in me after all." The word north passed through my soul like a sword. With all my ambition to encounter dangers, this word was like a shot. Lake Winnipeg, too, where all our people suffered so much every year, where so many had died of hunger in all its most frightful shapes, was not calculated to reassure me. I, who had suffered so much the year before in that fine country of Rive de Soto. I don't believe I ever recovered the full sway of my spirits after that. Leaving his Ojibwa wife in the care of another man, Nelson and his crew traveled 360 miles or 580 kilometers northwest to a post on the Rivière aux Morts, or the River of the Dead, now called Netley Creek, a tributary of the Red River, which enters the latter just upriver from its mouth at the southern end of Lake Winnipeg. In the Sorel Journal, Nelson explained that the waterway owed its ghoulish name to a massacre that took place there in the mid-1700s, in which a large Sioux war party slaughtered a band of Saulteaux Indians. Although his first season in southern Manitoba did not furnish him with much in the way of ghost stories, with which one might expect the Rivière aux Morts to abound, it did yield a number of colorful anecdotes. In the Sorel Journal, for instance, Nelson described an incident in which a rival crew of Northwest Company voyageurs gorged themselves on wild mushrooms, which quickly proved to be of the hallucinogenic variety. Later that season, some of his own men, without his knowledge, took revenge on a gang of swampy Cree who had attempted to murder them, by finding a barrel of rum they had cached in the woods, quaffing half its contents themselves, and refilling the barrel with their own urine. A more important event also took place in the season of 1804-05. Shortly after Nelson's transfer, Simon McTavish, co-founder and chief partner of the Northwest Company, died in Montreal, prompting Nelson's employer, the XY Company, to allow itself to be reabsorbed back into the Northwest Company. Thus, Nelson and his men found themselves working for and alongside their former rivals. Nelson spent the season of 1805-06 working a post on the southern shore of Lac de Bonnet, about 26 miles or 42 kilometers southwest of Lake Winnipeg, at a place known today as Wendigo Beach. Although the journal he kept during this time is little more than a chronological account of the often mundane tasks required to keep the Lac de Bonnet post running smoothly, peppered with a few hair-raising adventures, it does make frequent references to l'Île du Wendigo, or Wendigo Island. This half-kilometer-long spit of land, which sits near the eastern end of the lake, is named after a dark native legend, which we will explore shortly. The following year, Nelson was transferred to a new post at the mouth of the Dauphin River, about 145 miles or 233 kilometers to the northwest, on the western shores of Lake Winnipeg. Before his departure, he assisted Northwest Company partner William Mackay with exhuming skeletons from the cemetery at Bas de la Rivière, not far from the Rivière aux Morts. The Northwest Company had decided to rebuild the post in that area, called Fort Alexander, and Mackay concluded that the old cemetery was the ideal spot on which to build it. Ever after, mysterious fires occasionally broke out in the fort's kitchen, driving one Northwest Company proprietor nearly to despair. Nelson and Company began the journey to the Dauphin River in the early autumn of 1806. Along the way, they met with a terrible accident, which culminated in Nelson's first strange experience in Manitoba. On the morning of September 12, 1806, Nelson joined his men around a campfire, while the cook prepared their breakfast. Tragically, one of his voyageurs had mistaken a 50-pound cake of gunpowder for a barrel of sugar, and left it sitting by the fire. An errant spark from the pipe of his interpreter, François Richard, touched off the powder keg, generating a tremendous explosion which hurled Richard 15 feet over a tuft of willows. Nelson himself was severely burned by the blast, and had to be helped out of his clothes. In a later reminiscence in which he described the accident, Nelson wrote, "While the men were still busy employed in stripping the remnants of the shreds of clothing hanging upon me, in which they were necessarily very slow to give me the least possible pain, being so lacerated and excoriated, I turned my head towards Mr. Cameron's tent, where I heard crying, weeping, lamentations, etc. I saw, O God, a tall black man, shining like a Negro, a large frizzly head, bloodshot eyes, a thick yellow smoke issuing from his nostrils and mouth, and his tongue red as fire. My God, have mercy upon me. This is certainly the devil come to take me for my numerous sins." In fact, the ghastly apparition was poor Francois Richard, who had survived the explosion. The gunpowder had incinerated most of his clothes, and roasted him from head to toe. Nelson and Richard were doctored by both the voyageurs and several local Cree who arrived on the scene after hearing the explosion. Their burns were treated with a larch pine salve and a warm liquid which Nelson called swamp tea, and were covered with plaster. On the advice of the natives, Nelson forced himself to vomit in order to purge himself of the sulfur he had swallowed and inhaled. By the end of October, Nelson was nearly fully recovered from his burns. Richard, however, developed black infected ulcers above his kidneys and slid into steep decline. The 26th was very stormy, Nelson wrote, and the night was unusually dismal. About 8 o'clock at night, we heard a strange, very loud and shrill cry. It was again repeated. Some thought it was the cry of a loon, though they had long since returned south. Some a bear, some an owl. Some of the women said it was one of their water deities. "What is all this talking about?" said the poor old man. "It is my father, who has sent to warn me to prepare, for I must die." The next morning, about 8 o'clock, he breathed his last in great agony. May the Almighty God receive his soul into grace, mercy, and peace. George Nelson spent 9 years working out of various posts on the western shores of Lake Winnipeg, marrying a Saulteaux Ojibwa wife, and learning much about the Saulteaux and Cree natives with whom he conducted business. He documented his Lake Winnipeg adventures in his journal, and in later reminiscences, mentioning several strange experiences that he could not explain. On January 25, 1809, for example, while working at the Dauphin River post, Nelson and a voyageur named Etienne Charbonneau heard a great noise upon the lake, resembling an extraordinary clap of thunder. Later that night, he and his men observed that two celestial bodies, which he identified as the Evening Star, probably the planet Venus, and an adjacent star, not only seemed to be twice as large and bright as usual, but also appeared to bounce to and from each other, as to excite an uncommon degree of curiosity in everyone who beheld it. Nelson later learned that on the very same night, a Cree hunter encamped on the lake's northern shore awoke in the night to feed his campfire, and observed that the moon was very high in the sky. Less than half an hour later, after placing some wood on the fire and smoking his pipe, the Cree was astonished to find the moon sinking below the horizon. Another unusual event occurred on the night of February 20th, 1811, at the post on the Dauphin River. Several hours before dawn, one of Nelson's voyageurs, named Jean-Baptiste Larocque, awoke at the same time as his Ojibwa wife to see a mysterious hunched figure approaching the sleeping form of his comrade, Joseph Bertrand Desrochers. Frightened, Larocque turned his back on the apparition. The spectre apparently perceived this motion and directed its attentions toward the voyageur and his wife instead, stooping over the cowering couple before vanishing into thin air. Larocque and his wife were so shaken by the experience that they refused to leave their bed until a Dutch voyageur named Jean-Baptiste Wells lit a fire in the cabin. This strange event is rendered all the spookier, considering that it occurred during the height of a virulent epidemic of some mysterious hemorrhagic fever that was sweeping across the country, causing its sufferers to bleed out of their mouths and eyes. During this time, the Northwest Company developed a ferocious rivalry with the Hudson's Bay Company, or HBC, the Old English fur trading syndicate, which had controlled the Hudson Bay drainage basin since its 17th century founding. Nelson abhorred the duplicity and ruthless aggression which such cutthroat competition required of its participants. The demon of ambition, as he put it in one of his aforementioned reminiscences, followed us, blinding our better judgment, and sharpened our wits only to oppose, annoy, and injure each other. After a brief stint at a small trading post north of Lake Superior, Nelson quit the industry in 1816, taking his native wife and 4 daughters with him to his hometown, William Henry. Financial necessity forced George Nelson to rejoin the Northwest Company 2 years later, whereupon he was put in charge of a succession of trading posts in what is now northern Manitoba. His transfers gradually pushed him further east into what is now northern Saskatchewan. In 1821, when the Northwest Company, at the behest of the British Crown, amalgamated with the Hudson's Bay Company, Nelson was assigned to Cumberland House, an HBC post on the Saskatchewan River in what is now east-central Saskatchewan. In another of his journals, Nelson documented his journey from Fort William to his new post, Fort William being the old Northwest Company's field headquarters on the western shore of Lake Superior, located in present-day Thunder Bay, Ontario. One interesting landmark he encountered along the way was a huge impression of a dog on a hill, known today as Dog Mountain, which was visible from the Grand Portage des Chiens, or the Big Dog's Portage. This mysterious formation, which modern anthropologists have classified an effigy mound, appears in the journals and memoirs of several other fur traders, always accompanied by different native legends which purport to explain its origin. According to the version which Nelson learned from a Métis clerk, the depression is the final resting place of a gigantic dog, which the Sioux killed and buried centuries ago. The place is still visible, Nelson wrote on July 25, 1822, but far exceeding the size of any animal I ever saw.
After a year at Cumberland House, Nelson found himself in charge of Fort Lac La Ronge, a post in what is now north-central Saskatchewan, where the town of La Ronge now stands. In that lonely northern outpost, in the heart of Canada's vast boreal forest, in what would prove to be the twilight of his fur-trading career, George Nelson wrote a remarkable series of letters to his father, William Nelson, in which he described the spiritual beliefs of the Ojibwa, Cree, and Chippewayan Indians, alongside whom he had lived for 2 decades. These letters contain startling tales of strange animals and preternatural phenomena, which Nelson heard from his native friends, along with many of Nelson's own unexplainable experiences in the northern wilderness. In his first letter to his father, supposed to have been written in the spring or early summer of 1823, Nelson described the ritual of the shaking tent, a necromantic rite by which the Cree and Ojibwa purported to communicate with inhuman spirits for the purpose of acquiring occult knowledge. Nelson wrote that the frame of the tent itself, in which the ritual is performed, was typically composed of about 6 to 8 poles, each of them about 8 or 9 feet long, and 2 or 2.5 inches in diameter, arranged to form a cylinder with a diameter of about 3 feet. Each pole is stripped of its branches, sharpened into a point at one end, and driven a foot or 2 into the ground. That accomplished, the poles are encircled by 3 or 4 hoops, which are tied securely to each of them. Once the frame of the shaking tent has been erected, it is covered with skins or oilcloth, with an opening left at the top. The medicine man elected to perform the ceremony is then stripped to his loincloth and bound hand and foot, the constraint sometimes being so earnestly applied that the shaman is twisted into a crumpled heap. The medicine man's assistant then raises the tent's covering and thrusts the shaman inside with his rattle. Some medicine men, upon entering the tent, begin to sing. Others make a speech inviting any spirits present in the area to enter the structure. After a period of time, which could be as short as 5 minutes or as long as several hours, the cords with which the medicine man was tied are ejected from either the top or bottom of the tent, landing right in the lap of the assistant who tied them. It is then that the devil is at work, Nelson wrote. A succession of spirits proceed to fly into the tent, as evidenced by the rustling of fabric at the tent's upper aperture, or the shaking of the medicine man's rattle. When any enter, Nelson wrote, the hut moves in a most violent manner. I have frequently thought that it would be knocked down, or torn out of the ground. According to Nelson's informants, some medicine men were so powerful that their shaking tents required 2 concentric walls of poles, each of them encircled by well-fastened hoops. Thus arranged, the fur trader wrote, they seem to be beyond the power of any 3 or 4 men to move, yet when the spirits enter, it sets a-going with a motion equal to that of a single pole indifferently stuck in the ground, and violently moved by a man. I have never seen any of these double ones,
but twice or thrice saw the others, whilst the conjurer was in. Some time afterwards, when they were off, I shook them with both hands and with all my strength, but the motion was nothing like that of the conjurers. Nelson proceeded to describe the various spiritual entities purported to enter the tent. The first who enters is commonly the Turtle, a jolly, jovial sort of fellow, who, after disencumbering his votary, chats and jokes with those outside, and asks for a pipe to smoke. The Thunder also frequently comes, but he is desired to remain outside, as he would break all. It is reported that once he entered and split one of the poles to shivers. The Flying Squirrel also enters. He is no liar, but you must take everything he says the opposite. His nature is such that he durst not tell the truth but in this ambiguous manner, otherwise the conjurer would soon die after. I do not know that the Skunk ever comes, but the Wolverine does, and he is known immediately by his stink, which occasions no small merriment at his expense on the outside. The Loon also enters. He is known by his usual cry, "Ni-way, wee-way," I want to have a wife in Cree, repeated commonly 3 times, as he does when in the water. Nelson went on to describe another ghostly visitor called Strongneck, whom he likened to the mythical Greek hero Hercules on account of his tremendous strength. He does not seem fond of jokes, Nelson wrote, and when the other spirits announce his coming, all those on the outside must cover their heads and not look up, for it appears that he cannot come invisible as the others do, or will not, but still does not choose to be seen. Other spirits which enter the shaking tent include the souls of ancient Indians, the Sun, who speaks English, the Pike, who speaks French, the Buffalo Bull, who speaks a mysterious foreign language, the Bear, who makes a devil of a racket, the Serpent, who is supposed to be Satan, and the Trickster figure, whom the Cree call Weesuckajak. Those who attend the ritual of the shaking tent are free to ask the spirits questions about distant or future events. The spirits' replies are often incomprehensible to the attendees, necessitating the medicine man's translation. At the end of the ceremony, Weesuckajak commands the other spirits to return to their homes, whereupon the tent shakes one last time as the spirits depart through its upper aperture. While in Larange, one of Nelson's native clients informed him that, some years before his arrival, a Northwest Company fur trader, whom Nelson neglected to name, paid a local medicine man to conjure for him, in the hope of ascertaining what had befallen an inbound party which had failed to arrive on schedule. Before the ceremony commenced, the shaman exchanged a few heated words with a local Métis boy, who expressed his skepticism regarding the efficacy of the shaking tent ceremony. The medicine man entered the tent and began to summon the spirits. After a few minutes, those outside the tent could hear him crying out loud, as if in fear and surprise. Incredibly, his voice appeared to rise into the air, higher and higher, until it faded from perception. When all became quiet, one of the native onlookers urged the Métis boy to enter the tent to satisfy his skepticism. The boy did as requested and crawled under the covering. To his astonishment, the medicine man was nowhere to be found. The boy stood up, groping in the dark for any sign of the missing shaman. Suddenly, a ferocious cyclonic wind descended upon him, and small star-like lights appeared everywhere he looked. The boy scrambled from the tent, terrified, whereupon a faint cry sounded from the sky. The cry became increasingly louder, as if descending to earth, and soon the voice of the medicine man could be heard within the tent. The shaman emerged from the structure and informed the astonished onlookers that 4 spirits had carried him over the forest to the camp of the men whose tardiness the Northwest Company gentleman had asked him to explain. He correctly predicted that the travelers would arrive at the fort the following day. In the summer of 1823, Nelson witnessed an extraordinary shaking tent ceremony conducted by an ancient medicine man at Lac La Ronge. At the beginning of the ritual, the shaman was tied up so securely that the blood welled painfully in his fingertips. Before any of the onlookers could place him inside the structure, he slid across the ground and into the tent as if dragged by some invisible force.
This action was accompanied by an unearthly noise, which Nelson could not describe. No more than a minute and a half later, the cords with which the medicine man had been bound, not one knot of which appeared to be untied, flew out through the top. Nelson was struck dumb with astonishment. Before long, various spirits entered the tent and began speaking. Although the shaman suffered from a lung infection, which reduced his voice to a quiet rasp, some of the voices that issued from the tent were strong and clear. About midnight, Nelson wrote, the conjurer addressed me and asked if I wished to see any of the spirits. I accepted the offer and thrust my head underneath, and being upon my back, I looked up, and near the top observed a light as of a star in a cloudy night, about 1.5 inches long, and 1 broad, though dim, yet perfectly distinct. A little after 1 in the morning, one of my men looked in, with several Indians, and saw several small lights, about as large as the thumbnail. A few minutes before 2 a.m., they gave another shaking to the frame, and made their exit. At the end of his tale, Nelson concluded, I am fully convinced, as much so that I am in existence, that the spirits of some kind did really and virtually enter, some truly terrific, but others again quite of a different character. In a later letter, Nelson described another shaking tent story told to him by a Cree Indian. One summer, many years ago, the native in question had traveled to another Cree camp about 300 miles from his own home in order to visit some friends. During this sojourn, he met an old acquaintance who asked to purchase the items in his medicine bundle, the latter being a skin pouch in which lucky or sacred items called medicines are kept. The traveler did as requested, but the native erroneously suspected that he was withholding his most powerful medicine from him and grew angry. The native berated the traveler and warned him that he would pay for his selfishness one day. Hoping to put as much distance between himself and his disgruntled acquaintance, the traveler returned home. Later that winter, the storyteller was sleeping soundly in his own lodge when he dreamt that his soul left his body and flew over the forest to the country he had visited the previous summer. He saw himself approach an Indian camp, and then observed, with a thrill of horror, that his soul was being drawn towards a shaking tent. The Indian strained with all his might to avoid entering the ominous structure. As he struggled, he heard a friendly voice, which he supposed to be that of a benevolent spirit, forbid the conjurer inside the tent from doing anything malicious to the Indian's soul. Apparently afraid of the consequences of disobedience, the conjurer released the soul from his hold. Immediately, the Indian woke up in his own lodge, lathered in sweat, his limbs being forcibly restrained by 2 men and several women. They told him that, while he was sleeping, he had leapt from his bed and stalked about the lodge in the most dreadful agonies and convulsions, as if under the influence of some spell. The following summer, the Indian returned to the distant camp of his friends, where he learned that the native to whom he had sold his medicines the previous year harbored a grudge against him, and had attempted to lure his soul into his shaking tent, at the exact time at which he had suffered his horrifying nightmare. In another of his letters to his father, written in early April 1823, George Nelson described a supernatural entity called the Pakak, or skeleton, which the Cree feared to encounter in the woods. These entities were believed to be the ghosts of those who died in a state of emaciation, from either starvation or tuberculosis, and appeared in the form of skeletons with skin. At the time the letter was written, Nelson was playing host to a sick Indian, who claimed to have had several frightening encounters with these entities. The first incident, the native explained, took place on a spring night several years prior, when he took his canoe out onto Lac La Ronge to hunt moose. He paddled over to a shallow part of the lake, tied his craft to a clump of rushes so that it would not drift, and waited quietly, hoping to hear the bellowing of a bull moose. While he waited, the native discerned a strange sound in the distance, directly ahead of him. The sound resembled a human voice, crying, "Hey, hey, hey," in rapid succession, its tone oddly cold and monotonous. The hairs of his neck stood on end, as the noise drifted directly towards him, as if it were floating on the air. Terrified, the native laid low in his canoe, not daring to hazard a glance in the direction of the unearthly voice, which was now fast approaching. Despite this precaution, the aerial vociferant flew straight up to the canoe and threw the Indian into the lake. Choking and sputtering, the hunter scrambled for the shore, hounded all the while by the mysterious chanter, which hovered directly above his head, crying its metronomic incantation. Then I took some dry grass, the Indian told Nelson, which I rubbed and bruised till it became soft, and put it under my armpits, and crumpled myself into a small heap, and remained till the sun began to warm. All night long, the chanter hovered above the Indian, maintaining its incessant cry, before finally departing at dawn. The native's second encounter with such an entity took place while he was hunting beaver with a friend. The pair ventured far from camp, and after killing 6 beavers, built a roaring fire, and decided to sleep under the stars. I awoke in the night, the Indian told Nelson, and was much astonished to observe a man seated on the opposite side of the fire, resting his head on both his hands, with his elbows on his knees, apparently in a very pensive, sullen manner. He had but skin and bone, not the least particle of flesh, and this one had hair on his bony head. I gently pushed my friend and told him to look at that stranger. We were both extremely agitated in consequence of our fear, and were at a loss what to do. Having no alternative, I arose. Conceiving he came to ask for something to eat, I took a beaver, cut it in 2, presented him the half of it. He did not deign to look at it. I was much afraid. I then bethought of cutting it into mouthfuls, which, after presenting him, I threw into the fire. Thus I did with the whole, and when done, he arose and walked off peaceably in the air. The native's third encounter took place on the night of March 31st, 1823, several days before Nelson wrote his letter. At a late hour in the night, Nelson wrote, he was pulled most violently out of his bed, so that his wife that was lying beside him awoke, and with difficulty kept him down. Shortly thereafter, the cabin in which the couple were sleeping shook violently. Later on in his letter, Nelson described an elaborate ritual by which the Cree attempted to protect themselves from the vexations of these skeletal ghosts, which involved tobacco smoking, speech-making, dancing, incantations, and offering bowls of grease to a wooden figure intended to represent the spirit in question. In many of his letters, George Nelson described the Cree and Saulteaux versions of the Wendigo or Wetigo legend, as told to him by his Indian friends. Nelson introduced this frightening native tradition in one of his letters, writing, "There is a kind of disease, peculiar to the Crees and Saulteaux, and of which they have the greatest dread and horror, and certainly not without the very greatest cause. The consequences 49 times out of 50 being death, unfortunately, to many besides the subjects or objects themselves. They term this Wendigo, the proper signification of which is giant. Suffice it to say that the Wendigo are of uncommon size. Goliath is an unborn infant to them, their head reaching the tops of the highest poplars, about 70 or 80 feet. They are of proportionate size. Of course they must be very heavy. Their gait, though grand and majestic, at every step the earth shakes. They frequently pursue their prey invisibly, yet they cannot so completely divest themselves of all the incommodities of nature as to prevent their approach being known. A secret and unaccountable horror pervades the whole system of one, several, or the whole band, of those of whom he is in pursuit. These giants, as far as I can learn, reside somewhere about the North Pole, and even at this day, frequently pay their unwelcome visits. It seems also that they delegate their power to the Indians occasionally, and this occasions that cannibalism proceeds from a sort of distemper, much resembling mania." Nelson went on to describe how, in the boreal forest, where the natives lead a nomadic lifestyle and subsist on game, men frequently went hungry. Out of desperation, some starving Indians were known to occasionally break their gravest cultural taboo and feed upon the flesh of the dead. "I believe that those who have once preyed upon their fellows," Nelson wrote, "ever after feel a great desire for the same nourishment, and are not so scrupulous about the means of procuring it.
I have seen several that have been reduced to this disturbing alternative, and though many years after, there appeared to me a wildness in their eyes, a confusion in their countenances, much resembling that of reprieved murderers. One of Nelson's Wendigo experiences took place on May 7, 1808, while he was working at the newly constructed post on the Dauphin River, on the western shores of Lake Winnipeg. In his journal, he wrote, "An uproar in the Indian camp has turned all upside down. It is occasioned by Old Muffle's women, Old Muffle being Nelson's nickname for Moufle d'Orignal, a prominent local Ojibwa hunter, two of whom went to gather gum, but find a very uncommon large track in the woods bent outward. They took it to be the Wendigo." 4 years later, in December 1812, while working on the Pigeon River directly east across Lake Winnipeg from the Dauphin River post, Nelson had his first encounter with a Wendigo. One evening, a Cree hunter at an Indian camp not far from his post began saying strange things to his married daughter, telling her that he loved her so much that he could eat a piece of her. When darkness fell, the man's teeth began to chatter, and a strange tremulous moan issued from his lips. He stripped stark naked, left the tent, and curled up on a pile of firewood that his daughter had laid on the ground outside. His daughter and son-in-law urged him to come back inside, but to no avail. The hunter spent the night outside and arose just before dawn, seemingly no worse for wear. Thus did he every night for about a month, Nelson wrote, and every time slept out naked. Nor would he eat, excepting at times a little raw flesh. In the daytime, he was more composed, but his face, etc., bore the appearance of one possessed by the devil. Eventually, the hunter recovered from his strange mental malady, and lived peacefully in the area for many years afterward. Nelson went on to relate several chilling anecdotes, illustrating the mysterious craving for human flesh, sometimes acquired by those who condescended to cannibalism. According to one story, sometime in the late 1810s, prior to Nelson's arrival in the country, a strange Indian woman paid a visit to the trading post at Lac La Ronge. Her appearance was haggard, wild, and distressed, Nelson wrote. However, she was taken into the house, questions put as usual, but the answers vague, indefinite, and contradictory. The traders gave the woman some good food, but although she appeared to be ravenous, she only feigned eating, slipping morsels down the neck of her gown. This roused suspicion, Nelson wrote, but what added to this was the extraordinary stench she emitted. The traders' suspicions were confirmed when one of their dogs dragged a ragged human shoulder blade in from the trail on which the woman had traveled. Horrified, yet lacking sufficient evidence that the woman had committed any crime, they directed their unwanted visitor to a nearby Cree camp. As soon as she made her appearance, Nelson wrote, the Indians immediately conceived what was the matter, but through charity as well as for safety and to find the truth, they gave her to eat, principally marrow fat. The woman refused this hospitality. She proceeded to kiss and embrace her host's children, as was customary among the Cree, and was unable to conceal the voracious appetite that this courtesy aroused in her. That night, the men of the household kept a watchful eye on their guest, sleeping with their weapons close at hand. Sure enough, the woman quietly rose from her furs in the dead of night, and crept over to one of the sleeping children. One of the men perceived this. Before the woman could do any harm, he seized a tomahawk and buried it in her brains. Nelson appeared to imply that, despite the devastating blow which the Indian administered, the woman began to attack him, and would have succeeded in killing him had his companions not leapt to his defense and put an end to her existence. Engaging in cannibalism was not the only way by which people made themselves vulnerable to the influence of the Wendigo. Anyone who happened to dream of the far north, or of a land filled with ice, was in danger of falling under the Wendigo's spell. In such dreams, the dreamer would often be invited to partake in a feast of fowl, or some other wild game that had been prepared for him. The wary dreamer, upon examining the victuals more closely, would find that the game he was enticed to eat was actually human flesh. Those who failed to recognize the true nature of the meal would, after eating their fill, be informed that they were doomed to become cannibals, and were advised that a particular sign, like children eating snow indoors, would portend their imminent transformation. A young Indian, a few years back, had one of the above dreams, wrote Nelson later on in the same letter. Noticing that the dreams seemed to be occurring more frequently, and with greater intensity, the Indian implored his friends to kill him if they ever perceived the slightest sign of his transforming into a Wendigo, warning them that he might soon become too strong for them to kill. He had been a good hunter and a peaceable Indian, Nelson wrote, and of course much loved by his friends. This business depressed them a great deal. Nevertheless, acceding to his wishes, the band members developed a plan by which to execute him. One day, the entire band packed their belongings and moved camp, as the Cree routinely did from time to time. On some pretense, the brother of the afflicted man convinced the latter to remain with them in the old camp for some time. Eventually, the brother declared that the band must have finished pitching their new camp, and suggested that the two of them rejoin them. The brother set off up the trail at a jog, leaving the sick man trailing behind him. When he was certain the afflicted man could no longer see him, the brother concealed himself in the brush, loaded and primed his musket, and waited for the Wendigo to be, hoping to ambush him on the trail. This was a preconceived scheme, Nelson wrote. The other men, of course, were not far off. The sick one drew near, in a very slow and thoughtful manner. However, when he came near to where his brother was hid, he stopped, looked up, and called out, "Thou thinkest thyself well hid from me, my brother, but I see thee. It is well thou undertakest. It had been better for thee, however, hadst thou began sooner. Remember what I told you all. It is my heart that is terrible. And however you may injure my body, if you do not completely annihilate my heart, nothing is done." The brother was certain that the sick man could not possibly have noticed him, so well was he camouflaged, and suspected that the knowledge of his presence was proof that his brother had acquired preternatural abilities as a result of his affliction. Convinced that the time had come, he emerged from his hiding place, raised his musket, and shot the sick man in the chest, aiming for his heart. The musket ball passed straight through the man's body, and the sick man dropped to his knees. To his brother's astonishment, however, the afflicted rose to his feet immediately, and continued on up the trail, laughing as he walked. The brother observed that not a single drop of blood oozed from the sick man's wound, and took it as an indication that his heart had turned to ice, as was said to happen to those possessed by the spirit of the Wendigo. At the report of the musket, the other hunters of the band rushed to the scene. Seeing the sick man alive and unharmed, they hacked him to pieces with their ice picks and tomahawks. According to his desire, Nelson wrote, they had collected a large pile of dry wood and laid him upon it. The body was soon consumed, but the heart remained perfect and entire. It rolled several times off the pile. They replaced it as often. Fear seized them. Then with their ice chisels, they cut and hacked it into small bits, but yet with difficulty was it consumed. Paul Kane was born in County Cork, Ireland, on September 3, 1810, into a family of 10. When he was about 10 years old, his family moved to York, Upper Canada, present-day Toronto, Ontario, where his father, a former British Royal Army cavalryman, took up a new profession as a liquor merchant. While studying painting at York's Upper Canada College, Kane became imbued with an urge to see the world, perhaps eager to lay his eyes on buildings, landmarks, and other scenes that might lend inspiration to his art. In 1840, he traveled down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and in 1842, he embarked upon a grand tour of Europe, an essential rite of passage for any 19th century artist. For 2 years, Kane traveled throughout Italy, studying the paintings and sculptures of Renaissance masters like Raphael, Murillo, and Donatello. After traveling through Switzerland and France, he decided to spend the winter in London, England. In that heart of the British Empire, Paul Kane met George Catlin, an American artist who had spent the past decade traveling along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, painting the Native Americans he met along the way, who was in London for the purpose of advertising his collection to prospective European patrons. Many of the subjects of Catlin's paintings, particularly those belonging to the tribes of the Upper Missouri, had only recently been introduced to white men and Euro-American culture, and practiced an ancient way of life, which Catlin suspected was fast disappearing. Catlin believed that it was the artist's duty to illustrate these dying cultures for posterity, and included that thesis in his 1951 book, Letters and Notes on the Manners, Customs, and Conditions of the North American Indians, in which he detailed his adventures in the American West. Inspired by Catlin, Kane decided to undertake a similar project in Canada. After earning enough money to pay some debts he had accrued in Europe, he returned to Toronto in the winter of 1844-45, equipping himself with a diary, a sketchbook, a box of paint, a gun, and a stock of ammunition. He departed from Toronto on June 17, 1845, with the intention of traveling to the Pacific coast. He would chronicle his adventures in his travel journal, from which he would later draw when producing his 1859 book. Kane traveled overland to Lake Simcoe, and by steamer and canoe, made his way across the Great Lakes to the trading post of Sault Ste. Marie on the St. Mary's River between Lake Superior and Huron. Upon learning of his intentions, the factor of the fort at Sault Ste. Marie advised Kane against traveling into the interior alone, instead encouraging him to accompany a Hudson's Bay Company canoe brigade the next year. Kane took the factor's advice, spending the remainder of the summer on Mackinac Island, among the Ottawa and Ojibwa, and in a Menominee Indian village on the shores of what is now Wisconsin's Lake Winnebago, where he was introduced to the practice of night fishing. Paul Kane commenced his journey across the continent the following spring. In March 1846, he made his way from Toronto to Lachine, a historic point of embarkation for fur traders, on the island of Montreal. There, he met with Sir George Simpson, the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, who made arrangements for him to accompany the HBC's Spring Brigade. Kane's journey across the Great Lakes was punctuated by a series of minor adventures, the most interesting of which took place when a steamer the artist hoped to catch departed Mackinac Island, near the junctions of Lakes Huron and Michigan, without him. In a desperate attempt to catch up with the vessel, and in spite of ominous clouds, which indicated the likelihood of an impending storm, Kane hired 3 boys to help him paddle through the night from that island to Sault Ste. Marie. After a night of the most violent exertion, he wrote, after running into all sorts of wrong places and backing out again, after giving up half a dozen times in despair, and as often renewing the struggle, our exertions were crowned with success. The voyage on no former occasion had been performed in so short a time, under corresponding circumstances, and to this day, the undertaking is still talked of as a rather notable adventure in Mackinac and the Sioux. Kane made his way to the western end of Lake Superior, where he managed to attach himself to a party of voyageurs traveling west up a grueling trail called the Grand Portage. These indentured HBC servants were headed for Norway House, a trading post on the northern shores of Lake Winnipeg. A few days into his journey, on the afternoon of June 1st, 1846, Kane had his first brush with one of the mysteries of the Canadian interior. On one of the waterways on the Grand Portage, Kane and his companions encountered a family of Saulteaux Indians, from whom they purchased some dried sturgeon. The female, Kane wrote in his memoir, wore a rabbit-skin dress. They were, as I afterwards learned, considered to be cannibals, the Indian term for which is Wendigo, or one who eats human flesh. There is a superstitious belief among the Indians that the Wendigo cannot be killed by anything short of a silver bullet. Kane went on to relate a story his companions told him about an event said to have taken place in the area some years before. According to this tale, one winter, a father and daughter killed and ate 6 members of their own family in an effort to alleviate their own starvation. Shortly thereafter, they encamped near an old Indian woman with whom they were acquainted. The old woman, seeing that the father and daughter were alone, wisely suspected that something sinister had taken place. As a precaution, she made the entrance to her wigwam slippery by pouring water over it and allowing it to freeze. That night, she stayed awake and listened for intruders, keeping an axe within easy reach. At around midnight, she heard snow crunching underfoot outside her dwelling. Peering through a crack in her wigwam, she spied the girl standing outside, apparently listening in an attempt to ascertain whether or not the old lady was sleeping. The woman pretended to snore, prompting the ravenous girl to rush toward the entrance of her lodge. Slipping on the ice fronting the entrance, the girl tumbled into the wigwam, where the old woman split her head with an axe. Fearing that the girl's father would seek out and murder her before dawn, the old lady slipped out of her dwelling and retreated into the night. Her fears were justified. Later that night, the father, who had been lurking nearby in the darkness, crept into the old woman's wigwam, where he expected to find his daughter dismembering the crone's corpse. When he saw his daughter's body, hunger consumed his senses. Without a moment's hesitation, he proceeded to devour her remains. The Wendigos, Kane concluded, are looked upon with superstitious dread and horror by all Indians, and anyone known to have eaten human flesh is shunned by the rest, as it is supposed that, having once tasted it, they would do so again, had they the opportunity. They are obliged, therefore, to make their lodges at some distance from the rest of the tribe, and the children are particularly kept out of their way. However, they are not molested or injured in any way, but seem rather to be pitied for the misery they must have endured before they could be brought to this state. I do not think that any Indian, at least none that I have ever seen, would eat his fellow creature, except under the influence of starvation, nor do I think that there is any tribe of Indians on the North American continent to whom the word cannibal can be properly applied. Kane accompanied the voyageurs northwest to the Winnipeg River, where he parted ways with them, and traveled south to the Selkirk Colony, a Scottish HBC settlement nestled in the Red River Valley. This area is the historic homeland of the Métis people, a hybrid nation born from French-Canadian fur traders and First Nations women who had their own unique way of life, bearing elements of both of the cultures from which they derived. Hoping to sketch a Métis buffalo hunt, Kane set out onto the Manitoba prairie with a Red River cart and joined up with a Métis band. The painter got his wish and more. After watching Métis hunters ride down buffalo from afar, Kane's hosts came upon a much larger herd composed entirely of bulls and invited the painter to partake in the hunt himself. After adjusting their saddles and loading their muskets, Kane and his hunting partners trotted up to the herd. When their prey took flight, the hunters spurred their mounts to a full gallop and rode amidst the fleeing animals. Kane described the spectacle in his memoirs, writing, "The scene now became one of intense excitement, the huge bulls thundering over the plain in headlong confusion, while the fearless hunters rode recklessly in their midst, keeping up an incessant fire at but a few yards' distance from their victims. Upon the fall of each buffalo, the successful hunter merely threw some article of his apparel, often carried by him solely for that purpose, to denote his own prey, and then rushed on to another. These marks are scarcely ever disputed, but should doubt arise as to ownership, the carcass is equally divided among the claimants." After witnessing a tense encounter between the Métis and a band of enemy Sioux, Kane returned to the Red River Valley and traveled north to Lower Fort Garry, or the Stone Fort, just upriver from Lake Winnipeg. There, he boarded an HBC sloop bound for Norway House, at the opposite end of the lake. He remained at that northerly trading post until August 14th, when he joined the Columbia Express, a flotilla of Viking-style York boats recently arrived from York Factory, the HBC headquarters on Hudson Bay, which was bound for the Pacific coast. This particular brigade carried otter pelts intended for the Russians as payment for the HBC's use of their territory in the Pacific Northwest. Kane and his new companions sailed west across Lake Winnipeg and up the Saskatchewan River, making stops at Forts Carleton and Pitt. They followed the river west across the prairies to Fort Edmonton, during which process they survived a battle with a prairie grizzly bear, skirted a Cree burial ground filled with the corpses of an entire band that had been wiped out by smallpox, and witnessed a special kind of Plains Cree buffalo hunt. The latter story is perhaps worth retelling here, as it challenges a common myth about frontier life taught to children in nearly every Canadian school. On the North Saskatchewan River, Kane and his companions came upon a band of Cree hunters who had built a buffalo pound, or corral, into which they had succeeded in driving a herd of bison.
As soon as all the herd are within the pound, Kane wrote, the entrance is immediately closed with logs. When once in the enclosure, the Indians soon dispatch them with arrows and spears. The Indians in this manner destroy innumerable buffaloes, apparently for the mere pleasure of the thing. I myself have seen a pound so filled up with their dead carcasses that I could scarcely imagine how the enclosure could have contained them while living. It is not unusual to drive in so many that their aggregate bulk forces down the barriers. There are thousands of them annually killed in this manner, but not 1 in 20 is used in any way by the Indians, so that thousands are left to rot where they fall. I heard of a pound, too far out of my direct road to visit, formed entirely of the bones of dead buffaloes that had been killed in a former pound on the same spot, piled up in a circle similarly to the logs above described. This improvidence, in not saving the meat, often exposes them to great hardships during the seasons of the year in which the buffalo migrates to the south. On the last leg of the journey to Fort Edmonton, just before coming upon the buffalo pound, a humorous incident occurred involving Robert Rundle, a Cornish missionary who had joined the party at Fort Carleton, for whom Banff's famous Mount Rundle was named. Anxious to arrive at Fort Edmonton, Kane, Robert Rundle, and Mr. Roward, the chief factor of York Factory, with the assistance of a Cree hunter, decided to proceed ahead of the York boats on horseback. During their departure, Rundle tucked a pet cat he had brought with him in the breast of his coat, tying a string around the cat's neck and securing the other end to the pommel of his saddle so that it could not escape. As soon as the horse broke into a trot, the feline passenger leapt from Rundle's lapel, to the astonishment and horror of the Indians, to whom it appeared as though the cat had materialized from thin air. The cat swung from the string to which it was attached. This pendulum-like motion brought the cat in contact with the horse's leg, which it instinctively clawed. The horse, in response, bucked wildly, sending Rundle flying. All present were convulsed with laughter, Kane wrote, to which the Indians added screeching and yelling as an accompaniment, rendering the whole scene indescribably ludicrous. Puss's life was saved by the string breaking, but we left her behind for the men to bring in the boats, evidently to the regret of her master, notwithstanding the hearty laugh which we had had at his expense. At Fort Edmonton, Kane joined a 20-man portion of the Columbia Express, composed almost entirely of Iroquois voyageurs, and traveled with them on horseback across the prairie to the northerly Athabasca River. They proceeded up that waterway into the Rocky Mountains. On the way, the party passed through the mouth of what is known today as Old Man Creek, which Kane called the Old Man's River, writing, "The Indians say that an evil spirit once came down this river, which is so rapid that no canoe can ascend it, and that having reached its mouth, where it enters the Athabasca, he made 5 steps down, leaving a rapid at every step. These rapids are a mile apart, after which he returned and went up his own river, and has not since been heard of." The company continued up the Athabasca, stopping at an HPC post called Jasper House, and proceeded into the Athabasca Pass. On November 15th, they reached a place called Boat Encampment, where they were greeted by a welcoming party, and supplied with fresh provisions for their subsequent canoe voyage down the Columbia River. Few who read this journal, Kane wrote in his memoir, surrounded by the comforts of civilized life, will be able to imagine the heartfelt satisfaction with which we exchanged the wearisome snowshoe for the comfortable boats, and the painful anxiety of half-satisfied appetites for a well-stocked larder. True it was that the innumerable rapids of the Columbia were filled with dangers of no ordinary character, and that it required the constant exercise of all our energy and skill to escape their perils. But we now had health and high spirits to help us. We no longer had to toil on in clothes frozen stiff from wading across torrents, half famished, with the consciousness ever before us that whatever were our hardships and fatigue, rest was sure destruction in the cold solitudes of those dreary mountains. The Columbia Brigade made quick time down the Columbia River, shooting several dangerous rapids and avoiding the occasional whirlpool. They made stops at Forts Colville, Okanagan, and Walla Walla, in what is now the state of Washington, and arrived at Fort Vancouver, the headquarters of the HPC's Columbia District, on December 2nd, 1846. Kane spent nearly 4 months in the Fort Vancouver area,
sketching various colorful characters he came across, and spending time at a trading post to the south in what is now Oregon City. On March 25, 1847, he decided to make for Vancouver Island, and, embarking in a canoe, paddled down the Columbia River. On his way to the coast, he stopped to make a sketch of Mount St. Helens, the slopes of which local Indians told him were inhabited by strange creatures called skookums. This mountain, Kane wrote of the Great Volcano, has never been visited by either whites or Indians. The latter assert that it is inhabited by a race of beings of a different species, who are cannibals, and whom they hold in great dread. They also say that there is a lake at its base, with a very extraordinary kind of fish in it, with a head more resembling that of a bear than any other animal. These superstitions are taken from the statement of a man who, they say, went to the mountain with another, and escaped the fate of his companion, who was eaten by the skookums, or evil genii. I offered a considerable bribe to any Indian who would accompany me in its exploration, but could not find one hardy enough to venture. Accompanied by native guides, Kane proceeded up and down a succession of rivers to Puget Sound. He then paddled up the sound and across the Salish Sea to Fort Victoria on Vancouver Island, where he would spend the next 2 months sketching the natives he encountered on various sketching excursions. During the course of his wanderings, he witnessed various Coast Salish mask dances and gambling games, as well as a healing ceremony conducted by a Nootka medicine man. The latter is epitomical of a traditional First Nations therapeutic ritual once practiced by tribes across the continent, which a surprising number of white observers claimed effected perfect cures. This healing ceremony took place in early May, when Kane and 4 Coast Salish Indian companions were traveling along the western shores of Vancouver Island. The party paddled south down the west coast for the Strait of Juan de Fuca, during which process they found themselves caught in a terrific storm. The Indians on board, wrote Kane of the incident, now commenced one of their wild chants, which increased to a perfect yell when a wave larger than the rest approached. This was accompanied with blowing and spitting against the wind, as if they were in angry contention with the evil spirit of the storm. It was altogether a scene of the most wild and intense excitement, the mountainous waves roaming round our little canoe as if to engulf us every moment, the wind howling over our heads, and the yelling Indians, making it actually terrific. I was surprised at the dexterity with which they managed the canoe, all putting out their paddles on the windward side whenever a wave broke, thus breaking its force and guiding the spray over our heads to the other side of the boat. During the course of their journey, Kane and his Coast Salish companions were accosted by Nootka warriors, whose chief, in an almost hostile manner, demanded that Kane draw his portrait. The artist and his companions were obliged to spend the night encamped near the chief's village on account of a storm. That evening, Kane witnessed the aforementioned shamanic healing ceremony, which he described thus. At about 10 o'clock at night, I strolled into the village, and on hearing a great noise in one of the lodges, I entered it, and found an old woman supporting one of the handsomest Indian girls I had ever seen. She was in a state of nudity. Cross-legged and naked, in the middle of the room sat the medicine man, with a wooden dish of water before him. 12 or 15 other men were sitting round the lodge. The object in view was to cure the girl of a disease affecting her side. As soon as my presence was noted, a space was cleared for me to sit down. The officiating medicine man appeared in a state of profuse perspiration from the exertions he had used, and soon took his seat among the rest, as if quite exhausted. A younger medicine man then took his place in front of the bowl, and close beside the patient. Throwing off his blanket, he commenced singing and gesticulating in the most violent manner, whilst the others kept time by beating with little wooden sticks on hollow wooden drums, singing continually. After exercising himself in this manner for about half an hour, until the perspiration ran down his body, he darted suddenly upon the young woman, catching hold of her side with his teeth and shaking her for a few minutes, while the patient seemed to suffer great agony. He then relinquished his hold and cried out that he had got it, at the same time holding his hands to his mouth, after which he plunged them in the water and pretended to hold down with great difficulty the disease which he had extracted, lest it might spring out and return to its victim. At length, having obtained the mastery over it, He turned round to me in an exulting manner and held something up between the finger and thumb of each hand, which had the appearance of a piece of cartilage, whereupon one of the Indians sharpened his knife and divided it in two, leaving one end in each hand. One of the pieces he threw into the water, and the other into the fire, accompanying the action with a diabolical noise which none but a medicine man can make. After which he got up perfectly satisfied with himself, although the poor patient seemed to me anything but relieved by the violent treatment she had undergone. Paul Kane left Fort Victoria on June 9th with a Nisqually Indian elder, along with the man's wife and 2 slaves. The company paddled down the coast of Vancouver Island and across the Salish Sea to Puget Sound, subsisting on a variety of exotic coastal meats along the way. During the journey, the old man pointed out a rocky outcrop in the middle of the sea, and told the artist a colorful Nisqually legend, which purported to explain its origin, along with that of the porpoise and its enmity towards seals. The painter returned to Fort Vancouver, and on July 1st, joined the York Factory Express, a fur brigade bound for the HBC headquarters on Hudson Bay. Kane accompanied the party up the Columbia River as far as the mouth of the Snake River. There, he took leave of his companions, hoping to see more of the Columbia Plateau. Throughout mid-July, he and a guide explored the surrounding area, visiting Palouse Falls, the Grand Coulee, which was said to be the haunt of evil spirits, and a Presbyterian mission headed by one Dr. Marcus Whitman. Later that year, Dr. Whitman, his wife, and 12 of their charges were murdered by Cayuse warriors in what is known as the Whitman Massacre, the spark which touched off the Cayuse War, fought between the Cayuse Nation and the U.S. Army. On September 22nd, Kane set out from Fort Colville with 6 voyageurs bound for boat encampment in the Rocky Mountains. On October 4th, the party encamped near a stretch of the Columbia River just north of present-day Revelstoke, British Columbia, which the voyageurs called the Dalles de Morts, or the Rapids of the Dead. This narrow strip of river, bounded by steep walls, was the site of 2 tragedies, the older of which evokes the Wendigo legend Kane learned from the voyageurs of the Grand Portage. About 25 or 30 years ago, Kane wrote, referring to an event that took place in 1817, an Iroquois, a half-breed, and a French-Canadian, having charge of a boat, had to descend this frightful rapid. Fearful of running it, they affixed the long line to their bow, and being themselves on the shore, they attempted to lower her gradually by means of it down the foaming torrent. The boat took a sheer and ran outside of a rock, and all their efforts to get her back, or reach the rock themselves through the boiling surge, were unavailing. The rope, chafing on the sharp edge of the rock, soon broke, and she was dashed down among the whirling eddies, and broke to pieces, with their whole stock of provisions on board. They then continued to follow on foot, along the rugged and difficult banks of the river, without food, guns, or ammunition to protect them from the inclement weather. At night, they encamped in a shivering and famished condition, not having been able to surmount more than 3 miles of the obstacles that obstructed their passage at every step along the banks. The next day, they proceeded with no better success. They well knew that if they constructed a raft, it would not live an hour in this part of the Columbia River, owing to the quick succession of rapids that here beset the navigation. In this starving condition, they continued their slow progress till the 3rd day, when the half-breed, fearing his companions would kill him for their food, left them, and was never after heard of, falling, in all probability, a prey to the wolves. The other 2 lay down, and the Iroquois, watching his opportunity, got up at night and beat his companion's brains out with a stick, and, going to work in a methodical manner, after first satisfying his craving hunger with a portion of the body, cut the remainder into thin slices and dried them in the sun, after the manner in which buffalo meat is prepared. The Iroquois spent 3 days preparing his hideous victuals. When they were sufficiently dry, he stuffed the meat strips into a pack and proceeded down the riverbank to the head of Upper Arrow Lake. There he made a raft, concealed his meat pack beneath pieces of pine bark, and paddled down the lake. He had not proceeded very far, Kane continued, before he met a canoe, which had been sent from one of the forts below on the Spokane River in quest of them, owing to their long absence. The newcomers immediately inquired what had become of his 2 companions. He replied that they had deserted him, giving at the same time an account of the loss of the boat. They took him on board their canoe, and one of the men, seeing the bark in the raft, and desirous of getting it to place under him in the canoe, the Iroquois shoved off the raft, with evident signs of confusion, on which the man, who had noticed his embarrassment, paddled up to it, and lifting the bark, discovered the dried meat beneath it, among which was a human foot. He was asked how he had obtained the dried meat, and replied that he had killed a wolf, swimming across the river. The foot with the meat was slyly deposited in a bag belonging to one of the men, but not without the act being perceived by the murderer, who, while they were asleep during the night, threw the bag and its contents into the river. Appearing not to notice its loss, they went on to Fort Spokane and delivered him up to Mr. McMullen, the person in charge, detailing the particulars. The Indian was shortly afterwards sent to a distant post in order to get rid of him, as no voyageur would willingly associate with anyone known to have eaten human flesh. I had previously traveled several hundred miles with the son of this very man, who always behaved well, although there certainly was something repulsive in his appearance, which would have made me dislike to have had him for a companion in a situation such as above described. Kane and the voyageurs successfully navigated the Dalles de Morts and continued up the Columbia, arriving at boat encampment on October 10th. On October 29th, they welcomed and reprovisioned the westbound Columbia Express, laden with their load of furs for the Russians, before taking about 60 horses off their hands and striking out east on horseback. They toiled over the Athabasca Pass, trudging through deep snow and enduring biting cold, which froze the mercury on their thermometers and transformed Kane's long red beard into a solid mass of ice. They stopped to rest at Jasper House and continued east down the Athabasca River on snowshoe. They reached Fort Assiniboine on November 29th, after a grueling slog through the forest and over the ice, during which Kane fell through the ice of Jasper Lake, tore his feet to ribbons on the frozen strings of his snowshoes, and developed an agonizing inflammation of the lower legs, which often afflicts novice snowshoers, which the voyageurs called the mal de raquet, or the snowshoe evil. The travelers continued on to Fort Edmonton, where Kane spent most of the winter sketching the Cree, Assiniboine, Sarcee, Gros Ventre, and Blackfoot Indians, who came to the fort to sell dried buffalo meat and rendered bison fat. The Indian and Métis women of the fort processed these ingredients into huge quantities of pemmican, a dense, imperishable, nutritious staple of the Canadian frontier, which was later distributed to other HBC forts for use on the trail. During his time on the North Saskatchewan River, Kane visited both easterly Fort Pitt and westerly Rocky Mountain House, sketched a Cree pipe stem ceremony conducted by a chief who hoped to make war on the Blackfoot, and helped a Métis hunter perform a clever ancient hunting trick, which, although not particularly mysterious, may nonetheless warrant a place in this piece. On this particular occasion, Kane accompanied Fort Edmonton's sole horsekeeper, an old Métis warrior named Francois Lucy, on a buffalo hunt, during which Lucy showed Kane an old Indian hunting trick called making a calf. After finding a buffalo herd, Lucy dressed himself in a buffalo robe, while Kane put on a wolf skin. Lucy crouched in the snow, crawled around, and bellowed like a buffalo calf. When the Métis caught the attention of the herd, Kane tackled him, whereupon Lucy bellowed more earnestly. Apparently convinced that one of their young ones was being attacked by a prairie wolf, the herd rushed to Lucy's assistance. When the buffalo were within musket range, the hunters stood up and fired at them, killing 2 cows and causing the rest to flee. Kane continued his journey east in the early summer of 1848, nearly becoming a sideline witness to a battle between the Blackfoot and the Cree, fought just outside Fort Carleton. The battle took place on June 5th, and news of the occurrence reached Fort Carleton the following day. According to Kane, the Cree had gathered together to form a large war party of their own, about 14 miles from the fort. They held a medicine dance around a tall pole, from the top of which they hung their medicine bundles. Following the ceremony, they set out in search of the Blackfoot. Shortly after their departure, the Blackfoot discovered the Cree's medicine pole. One of the Blackfoot braves decided to climb the pole in order to remove the medicine bundles at its top, and in doing so, spied the Cree war party in the distance. As the Blackfoot warriors advanced towards their enemies, they were spotted by a Cree scout who underestimated their numbers. The Cree braves subsequently rushed to meet their foes, sure of an easy victory. They only realized their error by the time they engaged the Blackfoot vanguard in hand-to-hand combat, whereupon they fled for their lives, leaving their teepees behind as they raced across the prairie. The only Cree warrior who refused to abandon the field was a chief named Pehothus, who rode through the Blackfoot ranks and dispatched many a brave with his war club, wielding his weapon with bullish tenacity as he was riddled with arrows and musket balls. With the Blackfoot hot on his heels, his horse finally brought his shattered body back to the abandoned Cree camp, where two elderly Cree warriors, clad in their finest attire, had remained to meet their ends. Kane and his voyageur companions proceeded downriver to Cumberland House and La Pas beyond. In that northern trading post, the travelers met with naval surgeon Sir John Richardson and Orcadian surgeon Dr. John Ray, who were preparing to launch an expedition to the Mackenzie River to search for the ill-fated Arctic explorer Sir John Franklin and his crew, who had disappeared while searching for the fabled Northwest Passage. On June 17th, after shooting the Grand Rapids, Kane and company arrived at Norway House, at the northern end of Lake Winnipeg, where Sir George Simpson and other high-ranking HPC officers had gathered for an annual meeting. During his subsequent stay at Norway House, Kane was reunited with an ancient Inuit man from Hudson Bay named Spirit Chief, who was supposed to be 110 years old, with whom he had shared a canoe during his journey west. According to one story which Kane heard during his travels, which perhaps merits inclusion in this piece, Spirit Chief had only one son, whose mother died shortly after giving birth. In order to pacify the bawling infant newly bereft of his mother's milk, Spirit Chief allowed his son to suckle his own nipple. Miraculously, the Inuit man began lactating and managed to rear his son entirely on his own. On July 24th, Kane joined up with Major Donald Mackenzie, an old HPC employee and a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, not to be confused with his similarly named contemporary, who served as governor of the Red River Colony, and a company of Indians and voyageurs. The company paddled down Lake Winnipeg, surviving a ferocious gale, and subsisting on skunk and pigeons along the way. On July 28th, while waiting out a storm on the shores of Lake Winnipeg, Kane's Indian companions decided to build a jonglerie, or medicine lodge, a sort of spirit cabinet by which native medicine men purported to commune with both human and inhuman spirits for the purpose of acquiring occult knowledge. To build the tent, the natives drove 10 or 12 poles into the ground, forming a cylinder about 9 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. That accomplished, they covered the structure with a canvas boat sail, leaving a small opening at the top. After dark, the band's medicine man entered this tent and began to shake his rattle and sing various incantations. As this cacophony increased in intensity, the tent, so the Indians told Kane, began to shake on its own, moved by the power of the spirits that entered it. Although Kane did not witness the commencement of the ceremony, he found himself unable to sleep on account of the noise the medicine man was making, and, wrapping a blanket around himself, went into the woods to witness the proceedings. "I had no sooner done so," he wrote, "than the incantations at once ceased, and the performer exclaimed that a white man was present. How he ascertained this fact, I am at a loss to surmise, as it was pitch dark at the time, and he was enclosed in the narrow tent, without any apparent opening through which he could espy me, even had it been light enough to distinguish one person from another. The Major, who, with many other intelligent persons, is a firm believer in their medicine, told me that a Canadian once had the temerity to peep under the covering which enclosed the jonglerie, but that he got such a fright that he never fairly recovered from it, nor could he ever be prevailed upon to tell what it was that had so appalled him." After about 2 hours of shaking and singing, the medicine man informed his congregation that the spirits had showed him a vision of 5 boats with wind in their sails, a sure sign that the company would soon be on the move again. Satisfied, several onlookers began asking the shaman questions about the condition of sick family members back home, each time throwing a propitiatory gift of tobacco into the shaking tent through the opening in its top. Each query was succeeded by a flurry of shaking and rattling, after which the medicine man described in vivid detail what the family member in question was doing at that very moment, as if he had seen the Indian with his own eyes. After some time, Kane decided to field a question of his own, donating a double portion of tobacco, which yielded a double portion of noise. He asked about the fate of some of the curios he had acquired throughout the course of his journey, which he had been obliged to entrust to a courier. These souvenirs included the trophy head of a tremendously tough buffalo bull he had killed outside Fort Edmonton, which took him 16 bullets to drop, a bear's claw necklace given to him by an Assiniboine chief, which the latter had worn around his neck for 23 years, and the skull of a Flathead Indian he had stolen from a burial ground. The medicine man replied that he saw Kane's baggage stowed on a sandy point a 2 days' journey north, at a place where the courier had just made camp. However singular the coincidence may appear, Kane wrote, it is a fact that on the next day we had a fair wind, for which the medicine man, of course, took all the credit. And it is no less true that the canoes with my baggage were on the sandy point on the day stated, for I inquired particularly of them when they came up to us. On July 30th, Kane and his fellow travelers reached Fort Alexander, where a great number of Saulteaux Indians had come to harvest wild rice. Kane stayed at the fort for 4 days, before heading up the Winnipeg River with a new crew consisting of 7 Indians, 2 French Canadians, and an Orcadian. He and his companions tracked, paddled, and portaged their way upriver, laboring under the sweltering summer sun amid an endless cloud of mosquitoes. They continued southeast, across Lake of the Woods, and up the Rainy River. At Fort Francis, an old French turned NWC turned HBC fur trading post, situated at the confluence of Rainy River and Rainy Lake, which had been renamed in honor of Sir George Simpson's wife, Kane boarded a courier canoe laden with letters bound for Lachine. The party paddled and portaged their way across the wilderness of the so-called Northwest, stopping to admire the Kakabeka Falls, which, in Kane's opinion, far surpassed the Niagara in beauty and picturesque effect. The travelers continued on to Fort William and across Lake Superior, stopping for a day at Michilimackinac, and arrived at Sault Ste. Marie on October 1st. Here, Kane wrote, I consider that my Indian travels finish, as the rest of my journey home to Toronto was performed on board steamboats, and the greatest hardship I had to endure was the difficulty I found in trying to sleep in a civilized bed.